podcast. This is going to be a doozy. This may be our most controversial, and I would even go as far as to say most important topic or podcast episode that we've had in the 87 episodes before it. I think this is going to be the one that maybe most viewed, most talked about, most listened to, watched, but definitely a polarizing subject, and I'm excited to dive into it. I want to introduce my guest real quick before we start, and that is Berean Patriot. Berean Patriot is on a lifelong search for the truth on all things. He has this strange idea that God gave us intellect and reason because he wants us to use them. He personally tries to be like the Bereans, who were called noble-minded in the Bible, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. That's Acts 17, 10, and 11. When presented with an idea, he examines the scriptures to see whether those things are so, and that gets him into a lot of trouble at times. And I'm finding that it gets me into a lot of trouble at times too. So welcome to the episode, Berean Patriot. Thanks again for coming on.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'm going to just really quickly, I want to tag everybody in the comments just to make sure everybody knows that we're live. I would ask everyone to drop a comment, say hello, let me know that you were here. If you want to let us know where you're watching from, there's a good chance that Nicole with City Fam may go through the comments and be able to connect you with some people that are doing life in your area. Unrelated to this topic, by the way. But yeah, man, I'm excited. This is the first time I've ever had somebody on the podcast. I think I had two people on twice, two different people on two times, but never anybody. This is our fourth time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So I must think pretty highly of you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So let's get started the way we normally do. And I just kind of want everybody to know who you are, why you're not pictured here on the screen, and why you go by Berean Patriot. I mean, why you're anonymous.
Two basic reasons.
Sorry.
Two basic reasons. Cancel culture is a thing. I'd like to avoid that if possible. And more importantly, the world is replete with Christians who will believe things because a pastor says it. It's just, oh, this pastor says this, so I believe it. I've actually brought up in my own church and Bible studies, it'd be like somebody there mentioned, oh, hey, Pastor so-and-so says this, so it's true. And I'll whip out scripture and say, no, that's not true. And they'll be like, but Pastor so-and-so said it was true. And not even necessarily the pastor of my church, just some pastor on YouTube or whatever. So I don't want anybody to do that with me. I want you to believe what I say because it is rooted and grounded in scripture. And I don't want you to believe because Berean Patriot said it. I want you to believe because scripture said it, because Berean Patriot messes up. Unfortunately, I try not to as hard as I can, but I still mess up. I'm still human. And God's got this really unique thing of not ever messing up. So I would much rather you root and ground your faith, your doctrine, and your practice in scripture than what I said. And being anonymous helps with that because I may never have graduated high school. I might have 3 PhDs, might be anywhere in between, and you have no idea who, because you don't know what my qualifications are. You have to look at the evidence I present based on the evidence's strength alone and not on the strength of the person presenting it.
Love it. Thank you. Again, do me a favor. If you're watching, drop a comment, say hello. We're definitely going to address questions in the comments. There's a lot of questions that were posed on a live that I did with Nicole about a week ago. And that was really kind of why I wanted to do this with you, specifically in a group that I started called the Waiting Works Community. This will be the last time I post about this topic there, but there were just so many comments, way too many for me to answer individually. So hopefully we'll get to all the points. Most of the important questions and talking points I believe will be covered. Please be polite. If you're disrespectful or rude, we will remove you from the group. There's a lot of viciousness and name calling and disrespect, and you should be able to examine scriptures without fear or So let's I just wanted to add that. So drop a comment, say hello if you don't mind, even if you're watching the replay. And then I wanted to just kind of start off by saying something that I want people to know who you are, as far as like, if you feel comfortable telling everyone, your upbringing, how you were married. that you are in a monogamous marriage, and just some of that, because I don't want them to think that some of what you're about to say has a personal bias. But for me, what I was going to add was, I, for the last 23 years since I met the Lord, I completely believed in monogamy, because that's what, I was told and what I was taught. I would never consider that any other relationship structure outside of abstinence would be acceptable to God. And what that caused me to do was stay single for, over two decades, 23 years. I did have a girlfriend at some point in there that I was, having sex with when I was backslidden, but 18 of the last 23 years, I haven't had, regular sex. And I was waiting for, to meet a woman to marry under the belief that monogamy was the only way you could get married and it be accepted to God. And so I just will say that I say that to say, if you're where I am, I understand, because I bought it hook, line, and sinker like everybody else. And I bought it so much so that I, kind of in some ways lost out on 2 decades of my life, single, companionless, sexless, lonely, depressed. So when you talk about, like, even in our group, the Waiting Works community, it is related, because everyone is waiting until marriage, but they're waiting under a certain belief system that they've been taught. And if that belief system is inaccurate, which I'm not saying that it is yet, but if it is, I would think people would want to know. So if you could, Pat, as I like to call you, tell everybody, just really quickly, 30 seconds, about your upbringing, and then, how you met your wife and married, just real quick.
Okay. So I was raised in a pretty conservative, non-denominational church. I was saved when I was 4. My mother read Leading Little Ones to God to me. And so I was about 4. I got serious about my faith when I was about 12 or 13. I went to my dad and I was like, hey, I'm not sure I believe this Christianity stuff. And his response was, okay, well, I'll show you how to investigate it and you can try to prove it wrong. And, well, I mean, I'm still a Christian. So I've been a fairly conservative Christian my whole life. I was a virgin on my wedding night. I have one wife. I am certainly not seeking another wife.
Yeah.
I am not. So we got 2 comments here. One about Romans 13 and 1 Corinthians 7, both of which we will almost certainly talk about at some point today. My goal here is not to say y'all should have multiple wives. That's not my goal. I'm not saying that you should have multiple wives at all. The question is simply this: is it morally permissible, assuming it's legal, is it morally permissible for a man to have more than one wife? That's it. That's my only question. I'm not advocating for any particular practice. I am not saying you should have more than one wife. As a matter of fact, I think the overwhelming vast majority of men shouldn't have one wife, even if it's okay biblically. My goal here is to understand what God has said, not necessarily changing one's practice. If you don't want to have more than one wife, that's fine. If you're a woman and you don't want one, that's fine too.
Right. No one's forcing anyone to participate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I discovered this article that I've sent to many people that you wrote a few months ago. And to me, it was pretty compelling. And, a lot of the points that people brought up, you covered in that article, which is why I've sent it to multiple people, asking them to read it. But let's start off with this. Can you clarify the terms of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So there's 4 or 5 main terms here that sort of come up around this topic. And the first one is polygamy, which is, and it's an umbrella term. It includes all forms of multiple spouses. It's just an umbrella term. That's just what it is. And then another term is polyandry, which is when one woman has multiple husbands. And this is very, very clearly wrong. If you go to Romans chapter 7, verse, maybe it's 2 or 3, it says, if a woman, if a wife is joined to another man while her husband lives, she's an adulteress. So that is very clearly wrong. That's polyandry. And then the last major term, the one we'll use the most here, is polygyny. And polygyny is a specific subset of polygamy, which which refers to one man having multiple wives. Okay, so and those are the basic terms. There's one other term that's become popular lately, and that's polyamory,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of like polygamy only without marriage. They're basically just living together. It's not marriage. You're just living together, basically.
Gotcha. Hey, real quick before we jump into this, I want to give a shout out to a few people that have commented. Thank you for doing that. Austin Colas watching on YouTube. Thanks for that comment. Looks like we have several on Facebook. Looks like we're getting lots of questions and comments. Joanna Colbreth is here. Heather Morrison. Stuart Allen, who has been in the comments a lot. Stuart, thank you. Amber Mensch, Christy Lee, Teresa Ginther, Ramona Walcott up in New York. How are you, Ramona? I miss you. Beth Shotwell, Aaron Wendell, Britt, Brian Levy, Derek Nusk. Everybody drop a comment. Let us know that you were here. Feel free to drop your questions and your yeah buts and your but what abouts, all those things.
And
we'll try to.
By the way, speaking of questions and what abouts, all the questions that we've gotten so far in the comments here, I actually do have in my notes because I sat down and wrote out my notes so I wouldn't miss anything.
Gotcha. Good.
I do have all those in my notes. I do plan to cover them at some point here, and like Rob said, we will be doing Q&A. So if I somehow miss something, bring it up when we get to the Q&A, and we will definitely talk about it pretty much. Yeah.
All right, great. So let's just secondly, before we really dive in, why should people care about this? Because that is one thing that I've got a comment over and over, like there's more important things going on in the world than this. Why are you talking about this? I would say number one, God is leading me to talk about this. I feel compelled for some reason to talk about this. I'm not doing it, but I do feel compelled, and I believe I have great discernment. But why should just people care in general? Why about this particular topic?
So 4 reasons. 1 of them spiritual, 3 of them practical. The first reason is, if you're a Christian, you should want to know what God thinks about things. Marriage is a building block of our society. So understanding marriage correctly and appropriately is a good thing, because we don't want to call something sin if it's not sin. And likewise, we don't want to say this is not a sin if it is a sin. So we want to understand what God wants first. That's the most important thing. Secondly, and this is very practical, though not in the West, this is actually an issue in Muslim countries because they allow polygyny. So, I mean, imagine if you're maybe go on a missionary trip, shortest term, you're out there for a couple weeks. And at some point when you're out there, fella comes up to you and he's like, hey, I really appreciate you guys. I just became a Christian because your guys' teaching, but I have 2 wives and I have young kids from both wives, like young kids, maybe 5, 10, like young kids from both wives. And he's like, well, some of the other missionaries are telling me that I have to divorce one of the wife and kick her and my kids from her out of my house because God doesn't allow that. What should I do about that? And this is not really an issue in the West. It is, or at least can be, an issue in Muslim countries. I've actually had more than one missionary reach out to me, usually not on this topic, but if they're in Muslim countries, I usually mention it, and they're usually fairly appreciative that I do mention this topic because it does come up. There's something like, I believe, I just did the looking yesterday, it's something like 80 million people worldwide in polygynous households, something like that. That's not an insignificant number.
Yeah.
And so what do you do if one of those, a man or a woman, becomes a Christian and is in a polygynous marriage? What do you do about that? What is the appropriate response?
Yeah. I actually posted that question on my Facebook page the other day because I heard that before. And some people were like, well, if it's consensual, they stay in the marriage. And other people were like, they got to divorce everybody except the first wife. And I'm like, so you're saying the man abandons his kids and divorces his second and potentially third or more wives because of something that the Bible never explicitly stated? Like, that sounds like some healing on the Sabbath bullshit to me. Like, if we get to the heart of the matter, what does God care about? He cares about people. He cares about those kids. So that's and I would imagine with that many people in polygynous relationships worldwide, that people convert to Christ every day. Now, I don't know how many, I would imagine
likely
a pretty common issue.
Not in the West, not where we live, but in other parts of the world, yes.
Yeah. And that's a great point. I mean, obviously, I know your beliefs, so I don't even know.
I live in the U.S., by the way. So when I say where we live, I'm assuming. I know you live in the U.S. So I'm assuming a lot of your viewership does too, though I assume there's plenty in other countries.
Well, let's just get into it because I really want to get into the biblical interpretation on polygyny. So let's just dive in. Everybody buckle up. Here we go. All right, let's go with the 2 or 3 strongest verses against, because there are certain verses that were posted over and over and people believed, like myself, I believed, the deacon must be the husband of one wife. There it is right there. Now I will say personally, and this might sound bad, is I knew that if I wasn't a Christian, that I would have probably been in some kind of a relationship like this, but I would have never done it because I don't want to be disobedient to God. So this is why I stayed single and sexless, which was very difficult with the amount of options that I had to not be both. And number 2, I don't want to lead anyone astray. I'm very careful. Like, that's why I was so careful in the way that I live, but again, people find it hard to believe when I tell them God is in this and he's telling me to talk about it. Whether I do it or not, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. He's telling me to talk about it. So I will say, like, as that as a caveat, like I was there where everybody else was. I know the verses and I bought them just like everybody else did specifically. And I don't know if that's one of the 2 or 3 strongest verses, Pat, but that deacon must be the husband of one wife is one that people.
So there's actually 5.
Okay.
There's actually 5. Actually, you mentioned to me that you may want to do 2 or 3, and I was like, yeah, it's a good idea. And then I sat down to look, and I realized there is 5 strong verses, and we probably should do all of them.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it one by one.
So let's hit the relatively easy, relatively quick one first, and that is, a lot of people say, so polygyny is adultery. Like, that's, as a man having sex, he was married and they added another woman. He's like, that is adultery. So we actually talked about this on the previous podcast rather a lot. I don't want to do a lot of detail on that podcast, so I'll go into much less on this one, other than to say that, and let me actually quote scripture on this, because we can go into the word definitions just super briefly. So this is Exodus chapter 21, verse 10. Exodus 21.
I'm going to actually
10.
pull this up while you talk. Go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead. I'll share the screen as soon as I get it. Go ahead.
If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights.
Right. And now here's something I'd like to add to that real quick, because a lot of people are like, oh, there's descriptive text and there's prescriptive text. And people use, so that's an argument that I've heard a lot. I'm like, that Exodus 21 sounds pretty prescriptive to me. Wouldn't you say?
So it is prescriptive. It is if a man takes a second wife, and this is actually in the context. There's other contexts around this involving slavery, which we will get to.
Yeah,
people talk about that, because a lot of people say polygyny is like slavery. God just allowed it, even though He's not in favor.
Right.
We will talk about that.
Yeah.
This verse says very, very clearly, and actually, let me go ahead and read the following verse. Where is it? And if you will not do these 3 things for her, that is, if you won't provide food, clothing, and conjugal rights, she should go out for nothing without payment of money. And this is very clearly a divorce.
Right.
And somebody just mentioned divorce, and we will get to the divorce analogy as well. So here's the thing. This is a prescriptive verse. If you have more than one wife, you have to have sex with all of them. So this is one answer to the question of, is it adultery? It's not the best answer. I think the best answer is to simply look at what the words mean. So we did this last time, so just super quick. Easton's Bible Dictionary has the entry on adultery is conjugal infidelity. An adulterer was a man who had illicit intercourse with a married or betrothed woman, and such a woman was an adulteress. Intercourse between a married man and an unmarried woman was fornication.
Right.
So both the man and the woman were adulterers. Well, adulterers and adulteress, like,
why would
both
God
equally wrong.
Yeah, why would God go to the trouble?
But the definition of biblical adultery is when a man has sex with another man's wife.
Right.
That's the definition. So it's not adultery when a man takes a second wife and has sex with that wife, and it was in fact a requirement of the Mosaic law.
Okay, great point. Now, and in addition to the fact that Moses was a polygynist, so he wrote.
Yes, he did have 2 wives.
He wrote the law, And if it was adultery, under his own writings and teachings, he would have to be stoned to death because he was an adulterer.
He would. And the memory isn't that short. That literally the chapter before this, Exodus chapter 20, is where you get the 10 commandments.
Right.
Of which thou shalt not commit adultery is one. So he's not going to say thou shalt not commit adultery. And then what, 15, 20, 30 verses later say, oh, and you have to.
Right. Exactly.
Somebody asked, where do you find that Moses was polygamous?
Yeah.
So there is a verse that talks about, I don't remember where it is, but Aaron and Miriam were very upset at Moses because he married, I think it was a Cushite woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he was obviously already married to Zipporah, so that would be 2.
Yeah. And there's actually a third father-in-law mentioned, I forget when, and some people say that he had a third wife, but it can't be proven because we don't know if maybe one of his 2 wives.
Somebody just commented that's Numbers 12.
Okay, right. So there's a third person, a third father-in-law mentioned with a different last name. So he could have had 3 wives.
They're actually the same people. They're both Zipporah's father-in-law.
Okay. All right. So 2. So I've heard potentially 3.
So 2, but 2 is enough to establish.
But even
polygyny.
Right. And then of course all the David, and it's hard to believe that these men were committing these grave sins, leading God's people, and no one ever confronted them. But they were confronted for lots of other sins, but never for this supposed adultery. So I think, to me, that's a pretty clear answer. Do you want to move on to the next verse?
That's fine. Okay, so then the next one is so this is Matthew 19:5. And also Genesis 2:24, which talks about the 2 shall become one flesh.
Yeah,
that is one of the more popular verses for people to bring up, and I mean I understand why. And I thought I have it up here, but
what was the verse again?
Oh, right. Matthew 19:5. This is Jesus quoting Genesis. He says, "And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh." And the argument, actually, I mean, it makes some sense. Like it absolutely makes sense, because you can't have 3 people become one flesh, like 2. Like it's kind of a weird thing. However, there is another verse that quotes Genesis 2:24 about the 2 will become one flesh, and it's a very, very important verse because it kind of tells us what 2 shall become one flesh means, and almost nobody mentions it. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16. And this is right in the middle of those 2 chapters of 1 Corinthians where Paul is seriously taking them to task for their sexual immorality. And in the middle of that, he says, "Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, the 2 shall become one flesh."
Yeah. And the way
obviously quoting Genesis 2:24.
Right. And the way I've heard that explained was, so if it means what people are saying, it means that you can only become one with one woman, then how do you explain this guy that went and slept with a prostitute could have been married?
Well, and
was married.
That is kind of the point.
Yeah. And
that is kind of the point. And there's more context to this, which we'll get to in just a second. But this is a sexual euphemism. That's all it is. It's talking if a man becomes one flesh with a prostitute in the same way that he does with a wife, those 2 events are nothing alike. Yeah, I really can talk. I actually didn't sleep very well last night, so if I'm a little bit weird, I apologize. The man joining himself to the prostitute and the wife, they are nothing alike morally. The only way that they are alike is in the act itself. And I mean, if you think about the physical act of sex, there is very, very definitely a sense where you have the man inside the woman. There's some very definite oneness there. And most people who talk about this stops there. However, I have the advantage of having translated through something like 70% of the New Testament from Greek to English. And I noticed this when I was translating it too, this verse. The Greek word that means become is not in this verse. It's a very, very common word. It has an enormous latitude of meaning. It's translated many different ways, and it's not in this verse. A little bit more literally, it's, "And the 2 will be into one flesh." The 2 will be into one flesh. And the word there that's translated into is eis, and Helps Word Studies has, I'm just going to read the definition. Eis, a preposition properly into or unto, literally motion into which, implying penetration into or unto, typically with a particular purpose or result. And it's often used of going into a city. They went into a city, they went here unto this purpose is how it's often used. So, and by
break
the
that
way,
down
if
for
you
us,
want
because
to
I'm not
double
sure
check,
I'm following. So what is it? What is the verse basically saying based off of what you just said?
The idea of into, it mentions, it implies penetration, going into something, and not penetration in a sexual sense. I want to be clear about that. But in this context, I think it makes a lot of sense. And for anyone who wants to double check me on this, remember, my name is Berean Patriot for a reason. Go to BibleHub.com, search the verse, click on the interlinear Bible. Feel free to double check me on this. To the person who said I translated it yourself, how convenient. I mostly translated it for my benefit so that I would know the scriptures better. I'm certainly not planning to sell my translation. And if I ever publish it, it would be at cost, just to be clear. So there's some actual, so again, it is a sexual euphemism. The two shall become one flesh is a sexual euphemism. The most common way, or at least I think it's the most common way, to say they had sex in the Old Testament is he went into her. Like often, and so-and-so went into his wife or her and she conceived, and that's often how it's phrased. So this is just a sexual euphemism or idiom perhaps, and it's nothing else. And again, let me remind you of Exodus 21:10, where if a man has multiple wives, he has to have sex with both of them.
Great point. And there's also, well, let's keep going. I don't know which verses you're going to go to, so I don't want to jump the gun. Let's go with the third verse. I know it's one that's coming to mind, but I'll let you go.
Well, I'm saving the little bit bigger ones for a little bit later, because. So give me just a second here. So this is another one that often comes up, and this is Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 16 and 17. Deuteronomy 17, 16 and 17. And this is regulations regarding the king of Israel, just for context. So I'm going to read it here. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. And the word that is translated greatly increase is also the word that is translated multiply 3 times in those 2 verses. So you shouldn't multiply horses. You shouldn't go to Egypt to multiply horses. You shouldn't multiply wives, and you shouldn't multiply gold and silver. Basically, this is the word Rabbah. And again, if you guys think I'm wrong, if you think I'm stretching things, go ahead, click on the little interlinear on BibleHub.com, search the verse, click the interlinear. You can double check everything I'm saying. And as a matter of fact, I absolutely encourage you to do that, because I don't want you to just take my word for it. I want you to study it out for yourself. Be like the Bereans.
And if it meant more than one, which is because that is one of the verses that I've heard quite a bit. Why would he say use the same word for horses and gold? Because obviously, if you're a king, and number one, the argument could be made it's only for kings, because it doesn't say everybody, it says kings.
That argument could be made, yes, and it's not a bad argument,
right? So, but it says the word is the same for horses. Now, how is a king going to build a kingdom with one horse? How is a king going to build a kingdom with one piece of gold? It means hoard. And if you go to the heart of the matter, he's basically saying, don't put your trust in gold. Don't put your trust in money. Don't put your trust in horses. Basically put your trust in God. Don't put your trust in having a bunch of women for whatever reason. But it wouldn't be, a different word if it meant more than one.
It would be. And, but I don't like to speculate about what word it would be. I like to deal with the words that are there. And if multiply means not more than one, then you can't have more than one horse, which makes a lot of, because I don't know if you guys know that. So I really like military history, arms, armor, weapons. I have a intellectual interest in it. And one of the things that most people don't know, horses didn't used to be large enough to support men riding on them. Like they weren't big enough. So that's why the chariots were so prevalent for so long. And then they kind of disappeared. And you needed one guy to drive the chariot and one guy to operate the weapon. So if a king can't have more than one horse, how is he supposed to operate a chariot? Because you need at least 2 horses to drag 2 guys around with the size that horses were at the time. And further, the word that is translated multiply there is the word Rabbah. This is also the same word that's used of multiply and filling the earth in Genesis. God's command to Adam and Eve, multiply and fill the earth. This is the same word that is used to multiply Abraham's descendants. Almost every passage, and I don't want to say every passage because there may be other words, and I didn't look at all of them, but an enormous percentage of the verses in the Bible where you have something, God talks about multiplying something, it's almost always Rabbah, and it's a lot. It's an enormous number. Again, multiply your descendants so they're as the stars of the heaven or the sand of the seashore. It's more than, basically this verse is saying you can have more than one, but you can't have a ton. And I think it's the following verse, which I don't actually have in front of me. I think the following verse says, because if you have a lot of wives, they'll turn your heart away, which is exactly what
he
Solomon.
broke his own commandment. I definitely believe he hoarded. I mean, for sure.
Absolutely. And one more important thing about this verse. 1 Kings 5:15, and let me go ahead and pull it up here real quick. This is 1 Kings 5:15. Because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. And to be clear, that is talking about David's observance of the law. It is not saying that David is sinless. I just want to be clear about that. David was not sinless. He sinned more than just with Bathsheba. He had more than one sin, taking the census. But taking a census was not forbidden by the law. This verse says that David did not break the law except for in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, which obviously there's murder and adultery and all that stuff. Yeah. So other than that, he didn't break the law. So David had, I think it's 17 wives that we know about. I think if you count the names and then the ones that are just sort of mentioned in aggregate. And by the way, no Christian should have that many because the New Testament's commands come into play. But that's a
I would love people to be specific. If they're saying, "Oh, that's a stretch," you're making it fit. Be specific. What part are you disagreeing with? Are you disagreeing with the word? I mean, be specific, okay? And we'll try to address it.
Be specific. Because again, it says that David did not break the law. Except for in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So if David did not break the law, then that means he did not break this
Let's go into David, because when Nathan confronts David, whatever 2 Samuel, whatever it was, he says, the Lord says, he said, first he goes, "You are the man." The Lord says, "I gave you your master's houses and I gave you your master's wives." He says that. He goes, "And if they weren't enough, I would have given you more if you just asked." So think about this. If that is but
hang on a second. Before you get too excited, there's actually some debate about that, and we should absolutely handle that part of the debate carefully. So, do you want to sort of explain the debate a little bit first, and then you can? Okay. So the debate centers around a word here, and I don't actually know if I wrote down the word. I might not have written down the word, but you can check it. This is 2 Samuel 12:8 is the one we're talking about. And Nathan, I'm gonna read 7 and 8. Nathan then said to David, and this is after the Bathsheba thing, and then Nathan comes to him and tells him the story about the man who had a lot of lambs, the man who had one lamb, and David gets all upset, and Nathan's like, "You're the man. You are the man." And then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel." So God is speaking. "It is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these." Notice the translation that I read, which is the NASB, it said, "I gave your master's wives into your care." And I really should have checked the word. Give me just a second here. Because I wrote down the definition, but I did not write down the word itself. The King James translates that word bosom. That's how it's translated. And it's used elsewhere. And how that word is used elsewhere is it's relevant. So, for example, in Genesis 16:5, Hagar gave Sarah gave Hagar into Abraham's bosom, and then she conceived.
Yeah.
Like that's what the verse actually says. And actually, let me just go there real quick, because it's Genesis 16:5. Let me go there real quick and I'll read it. Just a sec. Oh, I didn't find it. Oh, it helps if you spell things correctly.
I think I'm in the NASB on this Bible Hub. I'm trying to get the NASB 95 to see what that says, the proper training.
That's okay. I got it. So, and Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid, and here it says, into your arms. But the King James says, into thy bosom. And again, it's the same word. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. There's very clearly a sexual component here, and there's a sexual component elsewhere as well. Proverbs talks about being in the bosom of a foreigner in the context of sleeping with a married woman committing adultery. I actually have a list of several more places it's used where the context is very, very clearly intimate and very clearly sexual.
Well, I've never even heard that argument, so I don't want to dive too deep into that, because I don't think anybody. I mean, not that I know. I don't think anybody doesn't think that David had 17 wives and he wasn't having sex with 16 of them.
And that's fine. I just want to point out that the idea of a man marrying the previous monarch's wives actually has precedent later in the Bible. David's own son, Abijah, he wanted to marry Abishag, the Shunammite, she was the woman. David was really cold, so they got a woman to lay next to David to keep him warm. And it has to specify she laid it in his bosom, but he did not cohabit with her. Like, they had to specify she's laying in his bosom, but they're not having sex. And they had to specify they're not having sex. And one of David's sons, after Solomon was crowned king, wanted to have Abishag as his wife. And Solomon said, "Oh, no. That's you trying to take over again." And had him executed for treason.
I just feel like
so there's precedent for marrying the previous king's wives.
Yeah, and in addition to the fact, going back to Exodus 21, if a man takes a second wife, he has to continue to provide for the first one and have sex with her. That was the law. Okay, David was living under the law. He was having sex with his wives. Next verse. Let's keep going. There's a lot to cover.
All right, so 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2. Let me go ahead and just read it.
1 Corinthians 7, verse 2.
Yeah. Here we are. But because of immoralities, some translations say temptation or fornication, or because of sexual immorality, something like that. Porneia, we actually talked about this. Because of temptation to immorality or immorality, each man is to have his own wife, each woman is to have her own husband. Now, this is one that I especially recommend that you go look up, because there are two different words used for own there. Right? The husband has his own wife and the wife has her own husband. The words that are translated own are not the same words. They are different words. The word for the husband is the word hiautu, which is a reflexive pronoun, and it means himself. It's a masculine singular reflexive pronoun. So himself. This is very strongly exclusive. The idea is the husband will have the wife to himself, or have the wife of himself, or however you want to translate it. Very exclusive, only to himself. The word that's translated own for the woman, that is her own husband, is idios, which there is inflected as idion. It's sort of like fight, fights, fighting. Same word, different word form. Idios is the base word. And I actually think the lexicons get this one slightly wrong, which I know is a really bold assertion, which is why I'm going to prove it. Some of the lexicons say that this means what is personal, private, what belongs to you and no one else. That does not comport with his biblical usage, and there are examples I can give. For example, in Matthew 9:1, it talks about everyone going to his own city, or maybe it was Jesus going to his own city, own being idios. Obviously, it was other people's city as well. John 4:44 has going his own country. Again, it wasn't his country exclusively. Acts 2, the falling of the Holy Spirit, and they're speaking, and everybody heard him in his own language. Obviously, they weren't the only person who spoke the language. I think the lexicons get this one slightly wrong. There is scholarship which agrees with that, but I don't want to get into it.
I want to break it down in layman's terms. Paul used two different Paul used two different words for the word own. One was exclusive, one was non-exclusive. One's used over and over for non-exclusive in the Bible. Look it up. And the other was used exclusive over and over. Look, if you don't believe us, look it up. To me, and what you said in your article, this is the verse that actually proves polygyny was okay with God, because why would Paul have gone to the trouble to use two completely different words that have two completely different meanings, one for men and one for women? If you believe that all scriptures God breathed, which is what I believe, that he was divinely inspired, not one little letter or anything was off. Why did Paul use two completely different words, one for men and one for women? And I will say the Bible was written, for the most part, the Old Testament was written by Jews and for Jews. And people, they didn't even believe this. They didn't believe in monogamy. It was nowhere mentioned in the Bible, nor did they practice it. And they're the ones that wrote the Bible. We're just grafted in, most of us. But we want to pretend like we understand it better than they did when they wrote it. And they didn't even believe it.
Well, and that's, so I do want to be careful about making a verse say too much. So I am going to disagree just slightly, but only just slightly. So I don't think the 1 Corinthians 7:2 proves that polygyny is okay in the New Testament. I simply think that it can be used as sort of a little indication you can throw on the pile, but it cannot be used to disprove it. Because again, the word for the man is utterly exclusive to himself, and the word for the woman, it's essentially emphatic. It's her husband as opposed to somebody else's husband. That's kind of, actually, this is funny. There's an article that argues against polygyny that somebody left in the comments saying, hey, they deal with this word, you got it wrong. And I read the article, and I was able to refute the article by quoting the article, because they basically said, yeah, this isn't an exclusive term. It's just strong possession. And by the way, if you Google Berean Patriot polygyny, my article should come up. I have citations and links for all of this stuff. So, or almost all of it.
I will say, I think I've done a good job of getting more people reading the Bible over the last 2 weeks than anyone I know.
Sure.
Just to prove me wrong.
And just, yeah. So, and by the way, I want to point out, his own wife, her own husband, this is actually in a sexual context.
Okay.
This is, if you read on a few verses later, it's where Paul says, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does, and the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. You all need to be having sex, except for if you're going to devote yourself to prayer and then start having sex again. Obviously, that's my paraphrase. But yeah, so this is actually in a sexual.
We got a million comments, and I want to get into some of these things that people are saying.
Sure. So there's one other big verse, and that is the husband of one wife argument, which I think somebody already mentioned in the comments.
That's a big one, and that's the one, honestly, for me, that verse cost me 20 years of my life, 20 some years. Seriously, because that was it. There it is, right there. I can't do it. Like, even if I would not disobey. So
right. So let me go ahead and just read the verse, because it's always important to read it when you can. We're talking about these sorts of things. An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, and then it follows a list of various other qualifications.
Tell me that passage again.
That is, let's see, I should know that. 1 Timothy 3, verse 2. I should know that off the top of my head. Actually mentioned in Titus. I don't think I mentioned this in the article. Titus uses the exact same words with the exact same phrasing. Somebody mentioned that in Titus, the husband of one wife. It's the exact same Greek words. I believe it's even the same Greek word forms, same context. So I'm going to treat those two passages together, because basically they're the same. So the big problem with this is it is a qualification for elders. And I actually have two answers to this. So I'm going to get the short one first. It is a qualification for elders, not all Christians. Additionally, we need to look at Matthew 19:10, because if a lot of people say, well, this is a list of things that all Christians should aspire to. They should all aspire to be respectable, hospitable, able to teach, that whole list of things. The thing is that Jesus directly contradicts that idea. And this is Matthew chapter 19, verses 10, 11, and 12. I'm going to go ahead and just read them. The disciples said to him, that is Jesus, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, Not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who was able to accept this, let him accept it. And I just want to add that word eunuch there. It just means alone in bed. It doesn't mean there were Christians literally castrating themselves.
Got it.
Just to be clear. I just want to be clear about that.
Okay.
So it is, and somebody said the best translation of mina in that text is first, and that's not actually true, which we can talk about in just a second. We can talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So this is a requirement for elders, not all men. So if it really does mean husband of one wife, and I would disagree with that, but even if it does, then it only applies to church elders and not Christians in general.
Yeah. In addition to the fact that this is what I heard, it would make a lot of sense. So if you really believe that that is what they're trying to say here, Moses, who wrote the law, who spoke face to face with God, who led the nation of Israel, he can't be a deacon at your church. Like, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Yes.
Number one. Number two,
David couldn't be a deacon.
David couldn't be a deacon at your church. He can't be a leader, and he was the king of Israel. And so that's a little hard to believe. Okay. Number two, that word for one wife is the word mia in Greek, which also means a or first. So it has a few. Is that true? Because that's what I read.
So you know what?
This says the believers gathered on the Mia day of the week. That's the word that Mia was used in that verse, the first day of the week. So some people say that you have to be the husband of your first wife, meaning you can't be divorced to be a deacon, or you have to be the husband of a wife, meaning you can't be single to be a deacon. Now, yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Let me provide an alternate way of looking at that, because other languages often use words. Instead of on the first day of the week, how about on day one of the week? And then it means one. And let me just go ahead and pull up the word, because you're saying this. It's been a while since I looked into this, so let me just go ahead. So the word is haste, and in that verse it's inflected as mina, because Greek words have the Greek definite article, which is the in English, has like 17 forms, 21 forms, something like that, something ridiculous. Trying to remember. The only place where I can find first is in very niche cases. There are places where you might be able to translate it first, and Strong's. And Strong's concordance is a concordance, not a lexicon. But this is actually irrelevant whether it means first or not, because there is another verse that actually leans on this. So I apologize for going into Greek just a little bit.
Just keep it. Don't nerd out on me. Just try to keep it a little.
All right.
We got a lot to cover.
That's fine. So let's look at 1 Timothy 5:9, because this is the other verse that is very, very important to this discussion that most people don't look at, but it is very, very important.
1 Timothy.
Let me get there.
I got it too.
Okay. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been, that word there is important, having been the wife of one husband. The words that are used in this verse are the same as the words that are used, husband of one wife, different word order, same construction, basically, but different word order. The word that's translated having been is the perfect tense, meaning it's an action that was completed in the past and is ongoing in the present. In Hebrews 2:12, it says Jesus has sat down, that's perfect tense, at the right hand of God. And many translations translate that is seated in the present tense, because perfect tense means an action was completed in the past, resulting in an ongoing state. All right. Many times in your Bibles, the perfect tense is just translated in the present tense, because we don't really have it in English. So the present tense would be is here, because it's just the verb for being. So let me read it. Read this as the present tense, okay? A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, being, or who is, the wife of one husband. That is, a widow must be the wife of one husband, present tense. Well, that's actually perfect tense, but present tense. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. You can't have a widow who is currently married. She can't currently be the wife of one husband because she's a widow. So again, I think this is a euphemism. I think this is a euphemism for sex borrowed from Roman culture. And the evidence for this is not as strong as I would like, but I think it's the proper understanding. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, the requirements for elders, the thing that is conspicuous by its absence is a requirement for elders to be sexually moral. There is no requirement for that if you read all the requirements, unless this is an idiom. Interestingly, the NIV
You lost me on that. You got to break it down a little bit more in layman's terms, because I didn't even follow you.
All right. I think the Greek there, I think it's one woman man, because the Greek word for wife is the same as the word for woman, and the Greek word for husband is the same.
Okay,
as the
so let's play devil's advocate. So if you're a one woman man, that's monogamy.
It is. And again, this is the one verse, again, applying to elders, where you can make a case that a polygynous man cannot be a church elder. And I want to acknowledge that is absolutely a case that you can make reasonably. I don't agree with that case. I think it's an idiom. And I spent like 2,000 words on the website unpacking this in the context. So it's really hard to summarize, and I apologize for that. But at Berean Patriot Polygyny, if you go to that section of the article, I do actually talk about it at length.
Okay, good. Let's get into some of these comments real quick. I think that was good.
Sure.
You did a good job on that. I'm going to go up. We're going to start. Let me see if I can scroll up here. Let's see here. I'm trying to figure out how to bring some of these comments. Here we go.
A lot of comments.
Yeah. I'm trying to get to the top here. Sorry, guys. I should know how to use this thing better by now. Okay. Okay, here we go. There it is. I found the scroll button.
Oh, if I can reply to one here.
Sure. Well, tell me which one you're, because I want to pull it up on the screen.
Oh, sure. So it's a timestamp 13:45:59. If that helps you find it.
13:45:59.
It says Moses married her when he was an elder. How do we know his other wife wasn't dead before he married the other? That is actually a reasonable argument. I will give you that. That is a reasonable argument. Zipporah might have died at the time he married the Shunammite woman. I don't actually know if Zipporah's death is reported.
I'd like to address that one, because I have an answer for that. I posted on someone else's, but it's going to take me a minute to pull it up. So while we're doing that, we're going to pull up another question. Most pastors tell you to be a Berean, but slander you if your findings go against the church. I find that to be 100% true. They don't want you to, even talking about this, I've suffered some vicious attacks. Even pastors reaching out to me. I'm concerned about you. Like, dude, I'm just investigating the topic, brother. Relax. Okay. Let's keep going. Got somebody from North Carolina. What about people who have the attitude, I don't listen. Let's see here. I don't listen to man. I just read the Bible.
I mean, no man is an island. And if, this is Paul talks about us being the body of Christ. And if the whole body were an eye, where would the ear be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? That whole thing. No, you should find good teachers. Sometimes it takes work. I will admit that. Sometimes it takes good work. But if you're reading the Bible all by yourself and you're not listening to any teachers at all, I think that is a bad idea. I think you should be discerning about who you should listen to.
Which is really challenging when it comes to this topic, because no one's going to agree with you in a mainstream church.
There's very few.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's keep rolling. I'm going to find this Moses thing here shortly, but let's go. Why? Please answer. Okay, I think we talked about this, but please answer why you think it's okay to break the law according to Romans 13. That's a great one. I'd love to hear that you.
So that is a really great question, and the answer is, I'm not saying it is okay. I want to be clear here. My goal with doing this podcast was, people are asking about this, and I think I have a relatively balanced. Again, this may be my own pride talking, but I try to have a really balanced view of things. Figured people they wanted to know about it, so I thought I will do this to give them a balanced view of this, because it's important. And Romans 13 is a great objection in America. There are other places where it's not illegal. So yeah, that's a great objection. I am not actually saying it is okay to take a second wife in America in the 21st century. I'm not saying that at all. My goal here, just to be clear, is what does God think? My goal is not to change anyone's practice. I'm not saying that anyone should necessarily take a second wife. I am not saying that, there's probably a lot of women listening who do not want their husband to have a second wife. And by the way, if you're already married, the odds of you being able to take a second wife biblically are almost zero. We'll talk about that later. Like, I'm not actually advocating that men run out and get a second wife. There's a really interesting study of polygynous Muslim men, and it's important that they're Muslim. We'll talk about that later. 62% of them, I think it was, said they would not recommend a polygynous marriage. Like, just be clear. I am not saying that people in America today in the 21st century should have multiple wives. Mm-hmm. I am not saying that at all. I am after, what does God think?
Right.
So maybe there's an argument for making it not illegal because God is okay with it. But I'm not saying you should try to get a second wife.
Right.
That's not my opinion.
I would say that in response to that, though, like, I know we're supposed to obey the law up until a certain point. First off, like, if you're thinking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now they were, the law of the land was to worship a statue or an idol at the time. And they're like, nope, we're not going to do it. So they did what they believed they needed to do in order to be obedient to God. And in this case, our laws have made it impossible to be, or illegal at least, to be obedient to God. In some cases, marrying your brother's widow, for example, was a command. Okay. So I would say that. Number two, I would say is and you and I disagree on this, but I don't believe that you need the government involved in your marriage. People would say you need it because of the protection of the woman, but that goes in the face of what Paul said about believers not taking each other to court. He's like, it's better to get taken advantage of than go to, sue your brother in Christ or your sister in Christ. So I believe that if you were to get married in the eyes of God, commitment ceremony, covenant ceremony, you don't need the government involved, which I think going back to the marriage rates being the lowest that they've ever been in history right now, 5 out of every 1,000 people are getting married. It's per year because men, they don't want it. They don't want the government involved in it. They don't want to get wrecked in family court. So
let me push back a little
sure.
bit. Let me push back a little bit because the topic of civil disobedience is a huge one. We could probably do a whole thing on that. Not that I'm saying I want to, but we probably could. The issue with civil disobedience is unless you have a very clear verse in Scripture that says, where God says, you shall do this, you should do this, you must do this, and the government is saying, don't do that, mm-hmm. It's really hard to make the argument that you should disobey the government. I am not saying the argument cannot be made. I understand the argument. I think it is reasonable in many cases. I'm not sure. Honestly, this is one of the things about polygyny that I'm still puzzling out, because the most important thing is being obedient to God. There's the condition of your heart, because the Pharisees were trying to be obedient and their heart was not in the right place. But the condition of your heart and then being obedient to God, like, that's the most important thing. And God does tell us to obey the governing authorities. So that is actually, in my opinion, the best argument for why someone in the West today should not have more than one wife from a moral standpoint, is because God says to obey the authorities. So
okay, yeah, that's fair. I think the governing authorities are going to try to force us to take a mark soon too, at some point, the mark of the beast. So do we have to obey? Possibly. Do we have to obey them in that case? No,
we do not have to obey that.
Like there are limitations to this, I will say, but
I'm not saying it's okay to break the law.
It's not okay to break the law. That's not really what we're here to talk about. We're not telling you.
Talk about, is it morally acceptable in the eyes of God, assuming it was legal?
Assuming it was legal. Gotcha. Hey, I found the response to Moses. I just want to read this really quick because I think it's worth reading. Okay. Numbers 12:1 states that Moses had an Ethiopian wife, and this caused controversy. This occurred between leaving Egypt and the first attempt to enter Canaan, a short period during which Zipporah is also mentioned as being still married to him in Exodus 18. So just from Scripture alone, we can deduce that Moses had 2 wives simultaneously. But much more information about Moses is given by Josephus, and when we read his account, also this becomes much clearer. Prior to his banishment, Moses became a very prominent figure in Egypt. When Ethiopia invaded Egypt and Egypt was rapidly defeated, Moses was appointed the commander of the army. He turned the entire war around through some shrewd maneuvers and defeated the Ethiopians. The final siege against their capital was ended when the daughter of the Ethiopian king broke her to surrender, partly involving giving herself to Moses as a wife. Her idea. She saw him from the wall, was very attracted to him. And this is Antiquities of the Jews, book 2, chapter 10, which means that she was Moses' first recorded wife, not Zipporah. After his banishment, he took Zipporah to wife as outlined in Scripture. Then, when his Ethiopian wife is mentioned in Numbers as causing a controversy, and therefore still around, even if she died many years before, there could have been no controversy. We find that the entire time he's been married to Zipporah, he's been a polygamist. We don't know if the Ethiopian wife accompanied him to Midian or stayed in Egypt, though, in a long-term distant relationship. We also read of another father-in-law to Moses, Hobab the Kenite. That's the one I was talking about, Judges 4:11. A different name and family to Jethro, Zipporah's father. This strongly indicates a third wife, though we know nothing about her, so we cannot be certain that she was married to him.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, well, I'm done now.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I'm not actually sure I buy that.
Which part?
Just to be clear, the Josephus, the Antiquity of the Jews, there's additional context which take a long time to go into. Regardless, there's a Facebook user said there's plenty of articles that oppose what you're saying. You may be right, you may be wrong, but that's okay because the argument does not hinge on whether or not Moses was a polygamist. Yeah. David definitely was.
Well, how do we reconcile this though? This first part, because this is the Bible. So Numbers 12:1 states he had an Ethiopian wife. Exodus 18, a short time before, talks about married to Zipporah. Why do people assume that she died when there's no mention of that, and it's only a short time between those two verses?
Again, I try to be as charitable as I can to opposing views, and I will have to admit it is entirely possible that Zipporah could have died before he married the Ethiopian woman. We don't know. And I think it is a very bad idea to build doctrine on verses, especially doctrine this big, on verses which are unclear. It's just unclear. We just don't know.
Fair enough. I think it's to me, it seems likely if it's a short amount of time and there's no mention of her death, but it's possible that maybe he wasn't. But if we go into here, what about this Hobab the Kenite? You said there was no third wife. So what is that all about?
If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I looked. I believe it's the issue of everybody in the Bible has a couple of different names, and they're addressed as different names at different points. I believe it's the same guy with a different name, but it's been a long time since I looked. I actually would like to shelve the was Moses a polygamist?
Good enough. Let's I mean, you're right. Even if he wasn't, there's a great list of patriarchs that were. So if he wasn't, then yeah.
All right. So
let's keep going.
Flipping this around.
Go ahead.
I'm guessing you want to look at the well, hang on. Do you want to knock out 2 or 3 super quick, short arguments against first before we get into the arguments with? This will take us like 2 minutes, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, hold on. Say that one more time. Knock out 2 or 3 arguments against.
Against that, it'll take like 2
minutes.
Then
we already do that. Oh, arguments or verses?
Verses.
Sure.
Sorry.
I mean, I thought we already. Didn't we just hit 5, or is there more?
We hit all the big ones. There's a couple little ones, like the first guy to be a polygynist was Lamech, who was supposed to be an evil guy. And people are like, well, see, that means polygyny is evil because the first person to do it was an evil guy. Right. Well, I mean, Cain was the first farmer. He was an evil guy. Does that make farming evil?
Right.
It's a bad argument.
Yeah. Okay, let's go into, here's one, the slavery. That's a big one I want to talk about because, in all honesty, I haven't had a good response on that because people are like, well, slavery's in the Bible. That doesn't mean it's okay to do. How would you address that?
So I would address that by addressing a lot of misconceptions about biblical slavery. And I'm just going to do it in really short form here. And then I'm going to give you a place you can go to get more information. So 2 Chronicles 12:8 talks about God's judging Israel. And he says, but they, that is Israel, will become his slaves. That's the guy who's invading, so that they may know the difference between my slavery and the slavery of the kingdoms of the countries. The quote unquote slavery that God allowed was very different from the slavery that you are probably familiar with. And first of all, it was voluntary.
That's exactly how I responded, by the way. I'm like, they're completely different kinds of slavery. The people sold themselves into slavery. They chose to go into slavery back then, right?
Yes. So it was basically the Hebrew bankruptcy system. If you couldn't feed your wife, your kids, yourself, whatever, you're going to be destitute. You would go to a guy, to a specific person. You got to pick the person. There was no reselling of slaves. That was not allowed. You went to a guy and said, hey, let me serve you for let me become your slave. And then for 7 years, you worked for him. And then at the end of 7 years, you went free with a bunch of stuff that your master was supposed to give you. And if you ran away, and this is in the law, and I'll give you a resource where you can look more about this, because I just want to touch this real quick. If you ran away, in the law, it says if there's a slave who runs away, you are not allowed to return him to his master. If he runs away, he runs away. And he's allowed to straight up just run away. Yeah. Now, he forfeits all the stuff that he was supposed to get at the end of 7 years. Like, obviously, if he runs away. So if you want to learn more about this, I keep meaning to write an article about it. I haven't yet. I recommend that you look up Mike Winger. That's Wing with ER at the end. Mike Winger, Slavery on YouTube. He talks about this. He goes through some of the verses. I think he's got a shortish video. It's like 10 minutes. That'll explain all of this. Slavery was voluntary.
Okay, let's keep going. You mentioned two arguments against. I brought up slavery. The first was Lamech. What was the
the one with Lamech, and then a bunch of people are like, well, in the garden, God only created Adam and Eve. He didn't create Adam and Eve and then another woman.
Great one.
And so here's my answer to that. God also created man to only eat plants.
He also created people naked, so a nudist could.
But we have arguments for absolutely they should wear. But we actually talked about nudity a little bit the first one and why it's not. So if you're gonna believe this, then you really should be a vegan to be consistent. However, there are nutrients that you cannot get from non-animal sources. I know some vegans, so I've actually done some research into this. There are nutrients that you cannot get from non-animal sources. So even if, and I'm not saying this is the case, even if God's ideal is one man and one woman, and I'm not saying it is, but maybe it is, pre-fall, post-fall, I'm not saying it is. And further, I'm not saying that everybody should have multiple wives, because if every man had multiple wives, you'd need twice the number of women. Like it just doesn't work.
Well, not necessarily. There's a lot of men that are in prison. There's a lot of men that are living under bridges, addicted to drugs, unwilling to marry. There's always more women wanting to get married. I mean, the practical reasons are enormous. I mean, just the fact of the wealth that the family would be able, the strength of the family unit in a polygynous marriage with all the kids and the father being in the home and all the incomes under one roof. A government doesn't want that. They would not want us. That's going to be a hard man to contend with. And
but it doesn't touch the issue of whether or not it is allowed.
Exactly. I'm just saying, we're talking about practical reasons. Let's go into this real quick. Is it God honoring? What would you say to
that? Let's establish whether or not it is permitted, and then talk about whether or not it's honored.
Okay. All right. Because I have some thoughts there. We could go ahead. Let me just.
And we can come back to honoring in a bit. But let's talk about this. Let's make sure it's committed first.
Okay. Let's see what this one says.
Permitted, rather.
I'm 37 and never married. I grew up under the extreme purity movement, which seemed to prolong my singleness and discourage interaction with the opposite sex. That's true. I mean, I don't really know what to tell you on that one. Do you have any thoughts there, Pat?
There were some unhealthy aspects to the that's a whole can of worms.
Okay.
So it's you should not have sex before married. And we talked about this. You should not be touching sexually before you get married. That does not mean you can't go on dates. It does not mean you should not date someone if you're, unless you're pretty sure you're going to marry that person. There was a lot of hyperness there that ended up being kind of unhealthy in terms of the outworkings, even though the ideas were good. So I don't. That's a little stickier.
Okay, let's keep going. I'm looking at the comments. God hated divorce, but also made regulations for it. So they're basically saying, God.
I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about that after we talk about the first verse that I think argues for polygamy. Okay. And then let's come right back to this question.
Yeah, let's go into that. Let's go into the verses that argue for. We did the arguments against. Let's go into the arguments, or the verses for, not the arguments, but the for.
Okay. So the first verse that I would go to, and this is by a mile, in my opinion, the strongest one. But there are other very strong. Well, it's one of the three strongest. So this is Exodus 22, verses 16 and 17.
Let me pull that up. Hold on. Exodus 22.
All right. 16 and 17.
Right, here we go. I'm sharing my screen. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and sleeps with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. All right, explain.
So, it should be bride price. If you check, a lot of translations say bride price there, but that's a totally different discussion. Dowry and bride price are different. The important thing here is the word man there. I have a question for you. What if that man was married?
Right. Now, what is the word used for man there?
So the word that's used for man there is the Hebrew word ish. It's used, actually, I have it written down, 360 or 376 times in the Old Testament, and almost 20% of the time, like 15, 20, I think maybe it's like 18%, something like that. Almost 20% of the time, it's translated husband. So Genesis 3:16, you know, the curse to the woman, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain, you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your ish, your husband, and he will rule over you.
Wow.
The word there, again, in Hebrew, there was no difference between the word for man and the word for husband, which actually reflects a cultural expectation. If you were a man, you were married and a husband. But that's another discussion for the time. This is a straight up command. If you seduce a woman, you have to marry her. And the command is to men. There's no exception made if he was married.
Yeah.
And the word there is often translated husband.
Yeah.
This is a command from God. And I want to be really clear about this. This is not God allowed for it. This is not, okay, it's not wise, but I'm going to look the other way. This is under this specific circumstance, you must take a second wife.
If you sleep with her, she's yours. You're responsible for her,
well,
basically.
You're required to, and the father could prevent that.
Yeah.
Okay. And notice the other than allowing herself to be seduced, the woman didn't actually have a say in the Old Testament. The father had the final say about who the daughter married. But nevertheless, and I actually did this badly in my article. I should have put this as the first reason. I think I buried it as like reason number 6, even though it's probably the most important. I might actually rearrange my article slightly just so it is first. But this is the most important argument, the strongest argument. And there's another verse.
Well, before you get into the other verse, I discuss this. Okay, go ahead.
God hated divorce, but also made regulations for it. Yeah. But here's the difference. God never, not even once, commanded divorce. And this is very important. And there's a couple of places where people go to say, yeah, God commanded it. The Ezra 10 one. I'll get there in a second. The Jewish divorce procedure is found in Deuteronomy 24:1, and it boils down to when a man divorces his wife, this is the situation under which he may not remarry her. It is not a command to divorce wives. It's a prohibition against remarriage in a certain very specific circumstance. That's what it is. It's not a command to divorce wives. And then if you look at Ezra 10, because everybody will mention, oh, yeah, God told, once the Israelites came back from their exile, God told them to divorce all their foreign wives. I recommend that you read that passage again. It's Ezra chapter 10. It wasn't God's idea. It wasn't a prophet's idea. It was the idea of Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel? I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it was the idea of Shechaniah. They did not consult God on this. They just did it. And so I am not going to say that God commanded divorce ever.
Right.
He allowed for it, but he didn't command it. He did command polygamy.
He didn't command slavery either.
Very true.
Okay, so this is the first thing that people are going to bring up, but that was in the Bible. Women didn't have rights back then; they couldn't take care of themselves. So, what I want you to do is discuss the historical and cultural context of that particular verse, so that people can understand better the significance. Like
which the Exodus 22.
Yeah, because people would say that was for then, not now.
So my standard go-to response to that is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Let me pull that up. Because this is a verse that most people miss, because there is a certain sense where you're absolutely right. We do not have to obey the Mosaic law. We do not. Christ took care of that on the cross. We do not have to deal with that. However, let me read to you Romans chapter 15, verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope.
Yeah.
So we do not have to follow the law. This is very clear. If you doubt that, read Galatians or Romans or most of Paul's letters, actually, but especially Galatians and Romans. But that does not mean we can't learn from it. And remember, God does not change.
Mm-hmm.
He does not say that what was sin then is not sin now.
Right.
He doesn't, like, that is not something that changes. And if it did change, that would be the scariest thing ever, because that means something that you've been doing your whole life could all of a sudden be,
a
horrific sin.
Yeah.
God doesn't change.
That's exactly what I've said. Name one thing that was in the Old Testament that was once considered right and not sin. Actually, a command, like you just said, and later it became sin. I'm like, I don't think there's anything. We don't have to fulfill the Mosaic law, but I don't think that's not. We're not. Those are comparing apples and oranges.
Again, I don't want to address whether or not people should have multiple wives. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying what is or is not morally permissible in God's eyes. Like, if you leave this podcast and you think, okay, fine, it might be morally permissible, but I think it's a horrible idea and it should be banned the world over, I'm going to say we probably shouldn't add to God's law, but that's a position that you're allowed to hold.
Yeah.
That's fine. You can think it's a bad idea. If God says it's allowable.
I like what you said in your article, where basically it was we don't have to fulfill the Mosaic law, but if you read the Old Testament, it does give you a pretty good glimpse into the mind of God on how he thinks the society should run, right? Because it's his people. He gives them some very specific laws, very specific. And that's, whether we have to do it or not under the new covenant, okay, great. We don't. Some people would say we do. I was talking to a guy named Pete Rambo, and he's a, whatever they call those, I forget what he calls himself, an Exodus something or whatever it was. But it does give you a glimpse, like you said, into the idea of, like, this is what God thinks about how society should run. And God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's just fashion changes, but
sure.
I don't think, I think God knew the devastation that sexual immorality would cause in the world, on women, on the children, on men, on marriage, and he wanted to keep it out. So he put some rules around, like, look,
no sex outside of marriage, which we talked about in the at length. Yeah. We talked about
that's what's selfish.
So
that's what's selfish.
We have two comments here. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's what's selfish. People say polygyny is, how is that God, honoring? I'm like, what's a lot less honoring is sleeping with somebody outside of marriage that you have no responsibility for, no commitment to.
So yes, but it is a reasonable statement. So the question, okay, so I don't think anybody would disagree that monogamy is God honoring. I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
No, I wouldn't.
So why, assuming that God is okay with polygyny, which I think he is, because he actually commanded, and there's two other places where he commanded it, which we can talk about soon. If God commanded it under certain circumstances, then why would it not be God honoring the way any other marriage is? And that is my answer. If God is okay with it, if he says it's fine to do, this is sort of, going out to eat with your friends and sitting down and having a nice dinner and talking is honoring to God. You're enjoying fellowship and just living life. That's honoring to God. Pretty much anything that you do that is moral is honoring to God.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's I think having sex outside of marriage is dishonoring to God. I think adultery,
very much so.
I think divorce is probably dishonoring to God. I think there's a lot of things that are dishonoring to God that probably most of us are guilty of, but I don't think that
we all sin. I try not to as hard as I can, but I still do, because I'm not perfect.
Religion is one of them. Let's read this one real quick. So a man is allowed to be jealous, but a woman isn't. A wife owns her husband's body equally. Let's talk about that biblically.
Sure. So just real quick, we had a comment the next comment I want to address after this, we had a question about stoning and animal sacrifices. I want to address that next after this.
Where's the timestamp on that? Do you know?
It's relatively recent.
Okay.
I'm just scrolling down a little bit. 141601.
You can pull that up after this. Go ahead. Talk this one, and we'll do that next.
So a man is allowed to be jealous, but a woman isn't. A wife owns her husband's body equally. So
scripturally, where does it say that?
Almost entirely true. So let's actually go to the verse. So what she's talking about is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So give me just a second here. Let's go there. Let's do 1 Cor 7 NASB. Helps if I spell it correctly.
What is the verse?
So I'm going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 7. For context, I'm going to read verse 1 through verse 6. Just to be clear, because I think that's what she's referring to. Now, concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband.
Oh gosh, this one.
The husband must.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I just said, oh no, this verse again. Go ahead.
Well, but I don't think that's what she's talking about. Okay. I think she's talking about the next 2 or 3 verses. So, and it's a legitimate question.
Okay.
The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And this is important here. This is the application. Stop depriving one another, except for by agreement for a time, so you may devote yourself to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this by way of concession, not command. So just to sum up, he's like, guys, if you're married, you should be having sex because the wife has the right to expect it from her husband. The husband has the right to expect it from her wife. You can mutually agree to stop for basically prayer and sort of a form of fasting. But then after that, you should start having sex again. And he's like, but I'm not commanding that you have to stop having sex to pray. I'm just saying that you can.
Yeah.
Like that's my summary. So let me go ahead and get the.
Don't nerd out on me. We got a lot to go. We got still a long way to go.
Sure.
We're an hour and a half.
This verse is talking about sex. The wife absolutely has a type of ownership over her husband's body, in that she absolutely has the right to require sex from him. That he will have sex with her, which you actually saw in the Old Testament passage as well. And the wife has the right to expect sex. And I don't mean, you can have it this instant. Hey, get in here. Like, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying sex is supposed to be a part of marriage. However, this doesn't really change in a polygynous relationship, except for that. I mean, how do I say this? He needs to be virile enough to keep up.
Yeah.
So absolutely, she is owed sex from her husband as part of marriage. And I'm not saying this is hey, you have to get into the bedroom now, or I'm not saying
unhealthy,
that.
Not in an unhealthy way. Gotcha.
Yeah, in a healthy way.
No.
Sex is supposed to be a part of marriage. So I'm not, but he has the right to expect sex from her. She has the right to expect sex from him. And this does not change depending on the number of wives, other than to point out that there comes a point at which you wouldn't be able to, because you had too many.
Gotcha.
Like that would not be so. And honestly,
okay.
The idea of a Christian having more than 2 wives or 3 at the absolute maximum in extremely rare circumstances, it will not match up to the New Testament's teaching on how wives should treat their husband, or husbands should treat their wives.
Okay, let's keep going. We'll go with that next comment that you wanted to read.
So somebody asked, and I lost it.
Okay.
Is there a way I can?
You said
the question was about, we don't offer animal sacrifices or stone people anymore either.
Let me find it.
So
you said it was 1452 or something?
1646, replying to Facebook user, I'm curious if they would approve of stoning and animal sacrifices since that was the law in those days.
I don't have it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, so animal sacrifices were taken care of at the cross. That's not necessary. The Mosaic law was taken care of at the cross. We don't have to do sacrifices because Christ sacrificed himself once for all, and we don't have to obey the law. Stoning was the typical method of execution, as a capital form of capital punishment. But we don't have to stone people. because again, it was part of the law. We're not required to do those things, just like you're not required to be polygynous. However, for example, the fact that certain crimes did warrant death tells us that God is not actually opposed to the death penalty. That's something we can learn from that. And it's for serious crimes and with evidence. I don't want to get into the judicial aspect of that, but we can learn things, but we don't have to sacrifice animals. We don't have to stone people because we don't have to follow the law, but we can learn what God thinks is moral and immoral through the law.
Well, let me ask you this then, because that'd be a great question. So like the law stated that if a man, potentially a husband, had sex with a virgin, he has to marry her. So we don't necessarily have to do that, but it makes it clear that it's not a sin to do that.
It is not a sin to marry. Obviously, it's a sin to seduce a woman you're
right.
Not
Yeah, you fornicate it. Yeah. So, but right. Basically, God's trying to prevent a cesspool from starting. Like you slept with her, now you're going to take care of her. Because I selfishly had sex with women that I had no responsibility for, and they went on to be someone else's future wife, and I don't think that's not God honoring. So no. I could see why God commanded that. Okay, was polygamy in the New Testament? Great question. This is what I would say to that, and I'd love to hear what you had to say, Pat, is that the Jews were polygynous in Jesus's time. All the early Christians were Jews. Okay, so I think there's probably a good chance that many of the Christians were polygynous, early Christians. The Jews didn't stop practicing polygamy until around 1,000 years ago. So and it wasn't because the Bible says so. It was because they were living amongst Gentiles and they were afraid of anti-Semitism. But feel free to correct anything that I said there.
No, that's very accurate. As a matter of fact, the Romans. So here's a fun tidbit. Do you know where we get the word romantic?
No.
The word romantic means to be like the Romans, i.e., monogamous. Interesting. Just the Romans thought that they were so morally superior for only having one wife and then having a ton of mistresses versus having multiple wives.
And I was told that was more about property than it was morality.
Yeah, there were issues, but the Jews were not willing to give up the practice of polygamy. Not that all of them had multiple wives; a relatively small number did, but they were absolutely polygynous for. Again, from Abraham, their inception at Abraham, who had Sarah and Hagar, until about 1,000 years ago, when they did away with the practice because it was causing them to be persecuted too much. Basically, is why they got rid of it, from my understanding, which is limited. I could be wrong on why they did away with it. It's been a while. However, was polygyny in the New Testament? And the answer is kind of.
Tell me.
So there is one parable that Jesus tells. We don't have an example of anybody where Scripture says, oh, yeah, he had multiple wives. That's not in there. However, there is a parable Jesus tells, and I want to be really, really, really clear. Jesus never married, okay? And we're really clear about that up front. Jesus never married. However, he does tell the parable of the 10 virgins. And they are very clearly getting married to Jesus. In the picture, again, Jesus was single. He did not marry. I want to be clear about that. It was a parable, only a parable. But in a parable, Jesus talks about himself marrying 10 women. Again, in a parable, he wasn't married. Why would Jesus picture himself as a polygamist if it was wrong? God would never tell a parable which depicted himself as doing something evil.
Right. He wouldn't compare himself to a pedophile, for example, in a parable. He wouldn't compare himself
to a murderer or anything like that.
An adulterer or any of that stuff.
Any of that. He's not going to picture himself as sinning. Like, that's just not something that he would do.
Let me play devil's advocate there, because some people say that the word for the brides, where it's bridesmaids, they weren't actually marrying Jesus, they were just part of the wedding party. Well, I would say this is, why did they go to the trouble of telling you they were virgins then?
So, and that is part of the thing. And history also tells us, I have been unable to find a single scholarly source that points to the existence of bridesmaids in first century Israel.
Right, that's fine.
And I've actually done a fair bit of research into marriage customs in the first century because it helps to understand the cultural context when you're reading certain passages. Like I could blow your mind a little bit about Mary and Joseph with some depth about their story, but we don't have time. But,
well, I think this is a good segue because I think we got off track a little bit. We were talking about the verses 4 and then we started taking comments.
So this is actually one of the verses 4. This is actually one of the verses 4 that I would bring up is Jesus pictured himself as a polygamist in a parable. And the word there, so somebody asked bridesmaids or virgins, and the answer is, the Greek word there is parthenos, and it means virgins. And if you don't agree with that, if you think that's wrong, go to BibleHub.com, look up the verse, click on the interlinear, and double check. Like double check.
I would love for someone to comment there because this is very specific, guys. And he just said, would Jesus compare himself?
Just go look it up.
Would he compare himself to something that was sinful? Like would he?
And so translations, like I think it's like the NLT, and most preachers will just assume that they're bridesmaids, but that doesn't work. So super quick marriage overview. She gets betrothed. He goes away to build a house or add an addition to his father's house. And then he comes back to get her, but she doesn't know when. Actually, the men did all the wedding planning. And he comes back to get her, but she doesn't know when he will come. And that's actually the whole point of the parable, is that she doesn't know. So let's say that they're bridesmaids. This process of building a house before they got married, between betrothal and marriage, could take 6 months to a year. So you're telling me that the woman who's getting married has 9 friends live at her house for a year waiting for the bride, or 6 months to a year waiting for the groom to show up?
Right.
I'm sorry. Can't buy that. That doesn't make any sense. And I have yet to find a single scholarly source that says bridesmaids were a part of the wedding tradition in first century Jewish weddings. I can't find a single scholarly source. If somebody knows of one, please share it. Link in the comments or something. I would love that, but I haven't been able to find one.
Okay, let's keep rolling. Do we have any other verses 4?
So there are a bunch 4. They are mostly repetition. There's 2 other places where God commands polygyny. Once in the case of levirate marriage, which is very much like the one we talked about, where you have, when a man dies and leaves behind a widow, one of his brothers is supposed to marry the wife, and there's a punishment if he doesn't. It uses the same words, man, husband. So it's very similar to the one about, when he seduces a person, he has to marry her. So we don't have to talk about that because it's the same issues. Some people will bring up exceptions to that. I deal with them in the article. I do think it's worth talking about Hosea, though.
Hosea. Okay. I don't know if I know that one.
Okay. Give me just a second here to pull it up. Oops. There we go. All right. So this is Hosea chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 2 and 3. Then when the Lord first spoke to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." So he went into Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son.
Right. Mary's the
prostitute.
Yep.
Skip forward 2 chapters to Hosea chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, where God said, "Then the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley." And just a quick side note, I don't know what God has against raisin cakes. That sounds like amazing to me, but
so
2 wives.
Yeah.
God specifically commanded one of his prophets to marry 2 wives. Some people will say they were the same woman. I'll deal with that in just a second. But God commanded him to marry 2 wives. This is very, very, very clear. As a matter of fact, the heading in the NASB, which is not inspired, says Hosea's second symbolic marriage. Some people say that they were the same woman. The first and the second were the same woman, but that is impossible. This is literally not possible, or God would have commanded Hosea to sin. So, as proof of that, we'll go to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 20 to 22. And give me a second here. I'm going to drink water. Okay. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 20 to 22. Now, if a man lies carnally with a woman who is a slave, acquired for another man, but who has in no way been redeemed nor given her freedom, there shall be punishment. They shall not, however, be put to death because she was not free. He shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord to the doorway of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord for the sin which he has committed, and the sin which he has committed will be forgiven him. So just to be real clear, if a man sleeps with another man's slave, it's a sin. So he married Gomer, and we know Gomer was free, and the second woman was a slave. So they can't be the same woman, because the second woman was a slave and Gomer was not, because, he slept with her and she conceived. So.
Got it. Okay. No, I think those are pretty convincing verses. Feel free to drop any comments that you have about those.
I do have an addendum to that, which I think which is another point in favor. And then we'll be sort of out of the real strong points after one addendum.
Okay. What is it related to Hosea too, or?
It is.
Okay.
So it's related to.
We've done enough there, I think.
Okay. Well, it's God picturing himself as a polygynist, basically, in the Old Testament. Jesus did in the New. God
right.
did in the
God
Old.
says, I have two wives, Israel and Judah, one's faith. Right. So there's that. Would God compare himself to something that was wrong because he says he has two wives?
Basically, like Jesus in the New Testament. Yeah.
This is not a biblical verse. Somebody said, "Why though, Rob? What does polygamy do for you?" I would have never believed that God was going to lead me to this place in a million years. Never. But I do see that the tremendous benefit that it could be for the world, and this is where I get real practical. Under enforced monogamy, we have a 56% divorce rate. We have about 1 million abortions a year, and we have rampant fornication because only 5 out of every 1,000 people are willing to get married anymore because of the structure of marriage. Something has to change. People say, well, you just need to convince men to be better men, and you need to convince women to know their worth. And I'm like, well, what have you been doing all this time, Pastor? Haven't you already been doing that? Haven't you already been trying to convince them? It ain't working. What are you going to do differently now to fix this freaking cesspool of a dating culture that we have? I believe that this is a great solution to it, and I definitely feel God leading me to talk about it. Whether I do it or not, I don't know. I think I will. But yeah, that for me, I think I want to change the world. I want to lead. I want to impact the world on a high level, and I think that this would be something that men would aspire to, because not everybody's going to be able to do it. Only a certain amount of men are going to have the money to do it.
Very small percentage, yeah.
Very small percentage of people are even going to be able to pull it off. But I could see what it would do for men in general, because they would be like, they would want to get stronger, better shape, make more money, so that maybe they could, have that if they wanted that.
And there's a bigger reason, which I know you wanted to spend some of this time talking about sort of the societal effects and some of the issues the more practical issues, which I think we should do next. But I want to bring up one comment that somebody said. So this is like the 4th or 5th comment right now. She returned to her life of son, I assume that means sin, and became a slave, referring to Gomer in Hosea. In answer to that, please show me the verse in the Bible where it says that a woman can sell herself into slavery, because I have done a fair bit of research and haven't found it. I do not believe that a woman was able to sell herself into slavery. I do not think that was a possible thing. I have not found a verse that says it was possible, nor have I found any cultural indications that it happened at the time. So if that's your position, that's fine, but citation needed. And if you have one, go to BereanPatriot.com, go to the contact page, email it to me.
Here's a question. God says not to lust after women. When you're in the habit of taking more wives, would you not then develop an even more lustful attitude towards women?
So we talked a little bit about that verse, what it means to lust. I think it was the previous one. It doesn't mean quite what most people think it means. You can go to that or that podcast to read it or to listen to it. Here's the thing. I am not saying it's necessarily a good idea you should take more wives. I'm not saying that you should want that. I'm not saying that at all. The issue here is, why is that different than a man who wants to have sex so he gets married, which the Bible explicitly says, like, it is better to marry than to burn.
Right.
If you cannot control yourself, find a wife. Like, that's what Paul says at several places. God says that through Paul. So why is it different with more than one wife versus one wife? And it is different practically because, of course, the Bible's commands to husbands about how they are to treat their wives does not change with the number of wives. That doesn't change. You still have to love your wife as yourself and all those. Actually, we should talk about that at some point. But I don't. Why doesn't this also apply to a single wife versus just one wife?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. I think what they're kind of saying is basically that, if you're feeding the dog by taking more than one wife, and you're just going to make that spirit of lust. I don't think I think if you're lusting, you're not, why would you marry someone? I mean, now look, you may marry them to have sex with them. I'm not going to say that that's not true, but I think you're way more likely to have sex with someone outside of marriage that you're only lusting after, because you're not in love with them. So you don't really want them necessarily to stick around after, and you don't want to be responsible for them. But what you're saying is exactly what's happening now in the world, is that 80% of the women are sleeping with 20% of the men. So they're out, have 4 or 5 women on rotation, and there's no commitment involved. So it's very scummy. It's very gross, because everybody's just getting passed around. So anyway, let's keep going. That's not necessarily a biblical.
Did you want to start talking about? I know you said at some point you want to start talking about some of the more practical, ethical, or moral.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's go into that. All right. So the ethical and moral aspects of polygyny. Let's discuss issues related to consent, equality, and the well-being of all parties involved.
All right. So real quick, I actually want to talk about the biggest moral problem here, which is Isaiah 5, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. It is entirely fine if you do not like polygyny, if you do not want a second wife, if you are a woman who does not want her husband to have a second wife. That's totally fine. I have no problem with that. I will probably back you up if asked, because some practical stuff we'll talk about. But don't call something that is acceptable and not a sin a sin. That is the biggest ethical consideration to mention up front. So if it's not a sin, don't call it a sin. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Love that.
So
that you pointed that out, because that was a lot of the comments. You sin, Satan has got a hold of you. Attack of the enemy, you're deceived. I'm like, show me in the Bible where it's sin, please. I mean, this is just your opinion. I get it. I get why you're saying it, because you've been brought up and conditioned to believe that it was, like me. Show me where it says that, though. Everything is just inferring. That's the best that we have, is this says this, so it means that. No, listen, look how explicit the Bible is about the things, all the rules around marriage and sex and all the punishments involved. And God never once commanded man not to take more than one wife, or even spoke negatively against someone that did it. Are you kidding me?
It does strain credulity, doesn't it?
What's that?
So let's talk about
what was that? What you said? It does what?
It strains credulity. It seems unlikely that God wouldn't have.
Yeah, he wouldn't mention it. He just forgot.
Right. Right. Yes. It's the all-knowing, all-wise God of creation.
Yeah.
Yes. Forgot.
Okay.
So you said, so let's talk about issues of consent first, because you mentioned it. So the first thing I want to mention is, ladies and men, if you are already married, the odds of you being able to be involved in a polygamous marriage are almost zero. And here is why. So, Numbers chapter 30, verse 2. If a man makes a vow to Yahweh, or, this is a second thing, a vow to Yahweh, or swears an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do she shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So, if you got up on your wedding day and you swore a vow to your wife that you were only going to have sex with her, and I have yet to be at a wedding ceremony where that was not a part of it, you can't take a second wife. I'm sorry, you can't. You made a vow. You can't. Mm-hmm. Now, there might be a possible exception if, because again, 2 parties in a contract can annul parts of a contract if you want. That's fine. So if I'm buying your company and we want to change 2 parts of an established signed contract, we can, by mutual agreement, change the contract. So it is possible that with your wife's, and this gets kind of weird with sort of the husband's role in the house, but it gets a little, if you had your wife's permission, maybe. But if you made a vow that you would not take a second wife, or that you would only have sex with your wife, you can't take a second wife unless she's okay with it, because again, you swore a vow and you should do all according to all that proceeds from your mouth.
Got it.
So that's the first issue with, you mentioned consent. Like, that's a big thing. Almost everybody who's married today has an exclusivity clause in their vows.
Yeah.
So
you can thank the Romans for that, fellas, if you're married.
Pretty much, yes.
And you're just discovering this information. Sorry.
Yet another way you can think about the Roman Empire on a daily basis.
Can't help you there. Keep going.
So I want to make that clear. There does not seem to be and I want to be clear. So don't react to the first part of this until I say the second part of this. There does not seem to be a requirement for a husband to get his wife's permission to marry, assuming it's not in the vows. However,
hold on, say that first part again.
There seems to be no specific requirement in Scripture for a man to get permission from his wife before he gets married to a second wife, unless there's a vow.
So it's not a ground. However, it's not a grounds for divorce necessarily if a man was to go out and do it. Is what you're saying?
It's that's a whole nother sticky. That's a whole nother sticky.
I thought that's what you were basically saying, though.
No, I wanted to say that a man doesn't really need to get permission from his wife unless he's vowed not to take a second wife. Okay. However, it's probably a bad idea.
Right. I would imagine.
In the overwhelming vast majority of cases,
I'd agree with that.
It's probably a really bad idea.
Yeah, of course. I'd agree with that. I will say I posted a comment the other day that a old friend, acquaintance of mine that lives in Thailand now, he said I saw your post, and he said over here polygyny or polygamy is the norm, and he said it's surprising to see, and he mentions, he's like, at first he says with the women, when there's a man and a woman in a like a monogamous relationship, and the man introduces the idea, or maybe another woman, first it's met with an immediate hatred, it said, and then an overwhelmingly strong attraction to said male, like then the woman gets really turned on by the man, and then it says, and then an inability to let go, meaning like she won't leave, she can't leave the man. And I was like, okay, not saying that's true, this is what he said. I did actually send that message to someone I know that's in a plural marriage, and they said yes, 100%. They saw it. You know, this person just took a second wife, and he says exactly what happened. And so I think about, let me finish what I'm saying. What that would do, if you think about if that's true, what that would do for society and marriage. Okay, so now you got more sex happening, right, with the first wife even, and now you got a second, so you got sex, you got more babies, you got the father in the home of all those babies, and you got no divorce. Doesn't sound like it's a bad thing.
So let's actually talk about a data-driven point for the societal good of polygyny. This is a really interesting point, which was sort of a side point in a book I read. The book was Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. And at one point so the book is about, he was recording the sexual practices of very different cultures, hence the title Sex and Culture. And he was looking at somewhere around 85 different cultures throughout world history that he had good data on. And one of the things that he found was societies where polygamy was normal and accepted were universally 100% of the time deistic. That is, they believed in a god or gods. There were no exceptions. And anyone who's taken statistics knows when you get a statistic without exception, it's almost always causal. It may not be causal. It may be coincidence, but that was a really interesting data point to me. That when you have a society where polygyny is a normal, accepted part of the society, that, at least according to this fellow's research, and I mean, he could be wrong, they tend to almost entirely be, believe in God. And as an example of this, and I want to be clear, this is an unhealthy example of this. Look at the Muslims.
Right.
You know, the Muslims have been devoted to Muhammad for the last, the religion's about 1,400 years old, and the Middle East was conquered over a relatively short period of time by the Muslims. It's a 1,400-year track history of them being absolutely committed and devoted to Allah.
Right.
Now, obviously wrong God. It's a problem, but
they're thriving.
They're thriving, and that's a very, very interesting corroboration. But then, of course, you know, and this is one of the problems when people look at this is why polygyny is really unhealthy. Is almost the only place that you can go for data on polygyny is either the Muslims, which have no problem with Sharia law. And I mean, I don't know if you know some of the stipulations of Sharia law. A man can rape any woman who's not wearing a hijab. That's part of Sharia law.
It's disgusting.
Like that's if you criticize basically any part of the Quran or Muhammad, or you try to convert somebody, or you convert away, then you're killed. And Sharia law also says that you should cut a girl's clitoris off.
Yeah. I didn't know about
like
that. Female castration. I have heard about that, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's so. There's an old saying in statistics which goes garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at something that is inherently unhealthy for data on polygamy, you'll draw inherently unhealthy data. And there's another point here that both Muslims and Mormons require a husband to have separate houses for each of his wives. This is actually a requirement in the Muslim law, and it's not optional. It's absolutely required. And the trouble is that creates an immediate conflict because, of course, you know, say, you know, I'm married and then, you know, I have my wife now and then I have a second wife. I have to buy her a house and then I have to split my time evenly between the wives.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately, the wives hate each other, or at least they want to, because taking the husband away from her and taking
maybe, you know, I don't know. I think we're making some presumptions there because I've talked to men that said some things to contrary to that.
But were they living in the same house?
I don't think.
Or did they live in different?
No, I think they were. Well, I think not initially, at least, because.
And that's my point. Yeah. Is so Jesus said, and this is in the context of divorce, but he said, "What God has yoked together, let no man separate." And that word "separate," man, there, it can mean divorce, but it can also just mean to depart from, or to live apart, or that kind of to create space between. Like it can mean you live apart. Jesus is fairly clear that if you're married, you should be living with your wife. And if you're living in a house, this is my speculation. If you're living in a house and you have two wives, it's much, much better than if they live in separate houses. If they live in separate houses, they can't help but hate each other because they're always taking the husband away.
Right.
One wife is always whereas if they all live
I
in the
don't know.
same
The sister wives, they had that set up. I mean, I didn't see it all the way through, but he was married to all three of them for 16 or 17 years from at the first season. Mm-hmm. So they lived in one house, but it was basically like three houses in one. So, and they seemed like they all got along pretty well. I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, maybe they hate each other. Maybe they don't. I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't think
I'm just saying
presume that's kind of going back to what you say. Like when people,
and that's fair.
You know, like we're trying to say that we know more than God. Like, oh, I can't imagine what it would be like if we actually obeyed him and, you know, or like, listen, you know, I don't think we're smarter than infinite intelligence.
I don't think we are. Yeah. And this is actually, so, and I made this point about, like on their first podcast, talking about sex outside of marriage. And somebody said, hey, you can't forbid sex outside of marriage. That will lead to horrible outcomes. And my answer to that was the same answer for forbidding polygamy on moral grounds. That is, I don't care if it will lead to horrible outcomes for, like, it may be terrible for the husband, it may be terrible for the wife, it may be terrible for the children. But if God says it's not a sin, I will not call it a sin. Right. I may say it's a bad idea. I may recommend that people don't get involved in all those sorts of things. But if God doesn't call it a sin, I can't call it a sin.
Yeah, love that.
If that makes sense.
This person says, sex is clear from Genesis. All who were created started the same way. So giving credit to, actually, that wasn't the way I wanted. Basically, it was saying, it was talking about Adam and Eve. And I think we kind of, here it is. I think we already addressed that. If Adam was the first human, was required to multiply, yet had only one wife, he is our ultimate example of what God wants. Again, I would say to you, even the Jews didn't believe that, because Moses was a Jew. He wrote the Bible, and they didn't even believe that. Whether he was a polygynist or not, Jews were not monogamous. So if they didn't believe that, how are you trying to push that and say that that's the ideal example when they didn't even believe it and they wrote the Bible? It doesn't.
Well, and more importantly, if God doesn't call it a sin, then I can't call it a sin. Now, you can say it's really unwise. There's an awful lot of things that you could do that are very unwise that are not a sin. You could say it's a bad idea. You can recommend that people never get involved with it. You can even want it to be illegal. But if God hasn't called it a sin, then we shouldn't call it a sin. So again, you might look at Adam and Eve and say, that is the ideal. And you might even be right.
How would you,
you might even be right. But
you can't call it a sin. That's where
you can't call it a sin.
How would your wife feel about you marrying another wife? That can't be talking to me because I'm not married. And here's in all honesty, we don't know how she would feel. We only know how she says she would feel right now. What I like to look at is not what women say. I like to look at women's actions, because when I see what's happening now with women that are single sleeping with the same men, the 20% of the men that are high status, they are polygamous. They're already doing it. They're sleeping there, and they some of them know about each other, and they're doing it anyway. So that tells me that some women, at least, would rather have a high status man that they have to share than a lower status man all to themselves, based off of actions, today, not their words. Women say they want a nice guy all the time, and then they go out and sleep with the asshole, the Chad, the guy like. So
sure.
You can.
And in the world today, they have the choice. They have the choice. If they don't want to be married to somebody who has another wife, they don't have to.
Absolutely. So I think we
to answer the question, I mean, just not in favor.
Conception.
I'm not like, again, it's not like I'm here doing this podcast because I want to run out and get a second wife and have everybody celebrate, the fact that I have a second wife and all. Like, that's not why I'm doing this. My interest is, what does God think? What does he say about marriage? What does he want us to do? That is my interest here. My interest is, what does God want, and what does that say about what we should do? Again, the example of evangelism in Muslim countries, because it comes up. It doesn't come up much in the West, but I'm not doing this because I want to run out and get a second, third, fifth wife. Like I don't. That's not my goal here. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I care about what God thinks.
Yeah. Let me address this, because it says, would you agree that God allowed it for the time and paradigm? How was it advantageous for women? I can't say how it was advantageous for women back then, although I do have some thoughts on that, but I can tell you how it would be advantageous for women now, because men aren't marrying. The marriage rates are the lowest they've ever been. So we have to find a way to make marriage more attractive to men, or make obedience to God, which is really what we're talking about, more attractive to men, because they're not caring about either. They're not caring about getting married. They don't care if they're about obedient, because they're fornicating and they're not marrying. And the women apparently are doing it too. So is it advantageous for women? Absolutely, because they're actually now getting the commitment. Now you could say, well, look, I would never marry someone in a plural marriage. No problem. Go out and find a husband that will just marry you monogamously. And don't have sex while you're looking. Don't fornicate. And then you'll get a real idea of how long you might be single. And this is, like I was telling Nicole the other day, some women, they may come to the realization that they're going to be single for the rest of their life, and they're never going to have sex again, and they're not going to have a family or kids. And if one of those women decides, you know what, I don't want to be alone for the rest of my life, I'd rather just, be in a plural marriage. Why would we stop her? You would force them to be alone? Because the numbers don't work. They don't even add up. There's not enough men to go around and marry all the women that want to get married. Not at least godly men. So yeah, I think it would be very advantageous for women, and not just women. Society at large, because you got to think about the kids too. You got to think about the children.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all.
So let me push back against that entirely, and yet agree with you some.
Sure. I love how you.
So well, because nuance. One of the advantages is it does increase the size of the pool of marriageable men, because you could look at a man who already has a wife, and if he's got a wife and kids and they seem happy and all that kind of stuff like that, that may be a signal. Hey, maybe you would want to marry him. So there is that advantage, because there's not a whole lot of marriageable young men. However, I don't want to go with the assumption, why would we forbid this when it's so practical? Because it's very easy. And I realize you're not doing this, but to be clear, it's very easy to say, hey, I think this would be advantageous, so we should do it, and move away from
biblical,
what God does and does not allow on this.
Sure.
So I do agree. I understand your point, but first, last, in the middle, and always, our question should be, does God allow this? Like, that should be the first question. Does God allow it? And then after that, is it wise?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff God allows that's really stupid.
Yeah.
Believe me, I was young and dumb once.
Yeah.
So to answer the first part of her question, though, would you agree that God allowed it for the time and paradigm? Yes and no. I would agree that God commanded it for the time and paradigm under certain circumstances, and he has never forbidden it. He has never called it a sin. And because he has never forbidden it, and he has never called it a sin, and he did it under the law, it was commanded, I, again, do not see a way that you can call it a sin. It may be unwise. It may be a bad idea. It may be any number of things, especially depending on the specific circumstances. But you can't call it a sin. And that is my whole point. I care what God thinks. I care what God wants. I want to be obedient to him. And I do not want to run afoul of Isaiah when he says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
What would you say to people that say, oh, you found a loophole? Because that's what there's like, oh, you're using a loophole to, be out. Somebody said, let me go back here. Basically, you found a loophole to something about God's best. Here we go. I don't see the fact that men are not committing as a reason to justify this. That's not
I agree.
Not of God. That's us trying to find a loophole or justify an alternative to God's best. God says each to find one spouse of their own to avoid sexual morality. And then she says, find one, Rob. Does it say find one?
So I agree very much with the first part of that. I don't see the fact that men are not committing or as a reason to justify that. He 100% correct. That comment is right on in that aspect. The way you justify it is, what does God say?
Right.
That is the question. I may disagree with some of the other stuff, but that point at the beginning is entirely accurate. We can't say, oh, it would lead to better outcomes, so it's okay. We have to say, God says it's okay, so it's okay.
I was talking to a friend the other day, and she's completely against this. And she's talking about, we just need to, convince women of their worth, and men need to do that. I said, listen, your own sons aren't even doing this. They're out fornicating, not unwilling to marry their girlfriends. And they were raised in a good Christian home. And you're this person that's, very influential, and you couldn't even get your own sons to do it. And now you're going to try to tell everybody, and somehow everybody else is going to do it. Like, it's not happening. And I believe the setup, the structure, I'm not even saying that, like you said, people should. I just think if it was allowed by, like, if it was legal, it might change the dynamics a bit. It might change the dynamics of marriage some, and it can't be any worse than what we have on our hands now, is my thought. But again,
of course it could be. I just don't think it will be.
Yeah, I don't know. How much worse could it be than what we're dealing with right now?
So one other thing that I think we should probably mention, because I don't think we've talked about this yet, is like I mentioned it, but we haven't talked about it. So Ephesians talks about husbands loving their wives as their own bodies, and this is an important point to make as it regards to polygyny, because the word love there, we've talked about this a little bit, and most of you who know what the word agape means will be familiar with this, is it means to do what's best for someone else. This is the selfless love. So do what's best for your wife the same way that you do for yourself. This is really hard with one wife. It gets, I would guess, exponentially harder with more than one wife. This is something to consider.
Maybe. I've heard people that have children, and they say it's better to have two than it is to have one. So I'm not saying, again, women aren't children, but we can't say if two kids are easier than one, then there's a possibility that two wives may be easier than one, because there's one person's taking care of the kids, the other one's doing the housework, or one person's working and the other one. There's a lot of reasons.
That is an interesting point. I haven't given that a lot of thought.
The sex gets split. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that it could go both ways. I don't think we can say it definitely is. But hold on. Let me ask you.
I haven't thought about that. Okay.
What about every other sin that's not mentioned in the Bible? This person said, and then she goes on to say, we must not look at biblical principles to extrapolate what is a sin and what is not. We cannot simply say it must be explicitly stated. Would you say?
Okay, cool. Okay, sure. So let's deal with the second part of that first. We cannot say it. We cannot say it must be explicitly stated. Okay. So what about when it is explicitly stated? Because God actually commanded polygyny under certain circumstances, narrow circumstances in the law, and
great point.
He never forbid it.
Great point.
So you're right. There are things that we are a little bit, oh boy, I don't know this way or the other. Yeah, sure, there are things that are like that, but polygyny is not one of them. God actually commanded it. He pictured himself as a polygynist. He rewarded Leah. I don't know if we talked about this, but Leah, Jacob's wife, he rewarded Leah for giving her. Well, that was Leah's opinion, and maybe it wasn't God's. So maybe we shouldn't mention that. But he commanded it, and he never forbidden it. So we can't really say that it's not explicitly stated here. It is explicitly stated. And then a second thing, this is completely unrelated to polygyny, just a general comment about the phrase biblical principles. When you hear somebody use that phrase, it always makes a yellow flag go up for me.
Why is that?
I rarely hear somebody say biblical principles and then follow that with sound biblical exegesis. They're usually saying, well, we know the Bible says this, which means we shouldn't also do this. And I have rarely found those to be correct. So the phrase, we need to use biblical principles, for me personally, unrelated to polygyny, that is a yellow flag.
Yeah.
Not a red flag, but a yellow flag.
Let's read this one here. I think God would be more likely to call polygynous unions lawless than for someone who actually wants to follow Scripture in a loving and honorable context. Again, based off of what Scripture? Why he would call them lawless when he commands you to do it in some cases? Doesn't work.
I think God would be more likely to call polygynous unions lawless than for someone who actually wants to follow Scripture in a loving and honorable context. I'm not sure I understand the second part of that, but there is, and this is a reasonable point about Romans 13 and other places as well, but Romans 13 is the clearest, where it says, submit yourself to the higher authorities. And the context there, it's governmental. And boy, you need a really strong case to disobey the authorities. And I mean, I've heard the case. I am not convinced about where I fall on that. You'd have to go someplace where it was basically not illegal.
Let's go and
for me to.
I just reading some of the old comments from the live I did in Waiting Works community the other day, and somebody said, the whole point of this group is to hold a standard, not to lower it. And then somebody said 99% of these comments are for monogamy and against polygamy, which is to be expected because it's a 99% Christian women in that group, and they're going to be the biggest critics of this. So where did just monogamy itself, the idea is, it's not biblical, it's never mentioned in the Bible. Where did it come from? Because the Jews didn't practice it, they were God's people. Where did it come from? When did it start?
Adam and Eve.
Okay, great.
So here's the thing. Simple math, there's approximately equal numbers of men and women in the world. Mm-hmm. Approximately. It varies and has throughout history, but approximately equal. And so polygyny is always very rare. Even in Muslim countries where it's legal, normal, and accepted, no more than 1 or 2% are in polygynous marriages, according to the best data I could find, which leaves 98, 99% of people who are in monogamous marriages. So it is the norm simply by virtue of what the numbers are. That it is the norm. That doesn't mean that it should be the only, but it is definitely the norm just by virtue of the gender imbalance. And by the way, there's actually some really fascinating, when you have a gender imbalance, like they have in Russia, there's like 1,000 women to every 800 or 900 men in Russia. Mm-hmm. There's actually been a resurgence of polygyny completely apart from Christianity or anything, just as a practical thing, just as a random interesting aside.
Which they're doing anyway. They were doing all those old Russian guys have young girlfriends on the side.
So we have two or three recent comments here about polyamory. So just a quick word on that. Like I said at the beginning, when we define terms, polyamory is when you have 3 or more people living together who are not married. Now, if it's a man married to 2 women, that would be polygyny. But polyamory, they're just living together with no marriage. And as we covered in somewhat exhaustive length in our first podcast, sex outside of marriage is wrong. And it's not wrong like a little whoopsie. Like, this is a very, very serious sin to have sex outside of marriage. So polyamory is in no way, morally speaking, anything close to polygyny. And if you look at the data on cohabiting versus marriage, it won't be the same in all of the other outcomes as well. Interesting fact, by the way. And let me actually pull this statistic up, because this was really interesting about when a man, let's see if I can find it real quick. Okay. So this is from a study I read about the effect of polygyny on children. While all the polygamous men had children from their first wives, 71.4% of them also had children from their second wives. Marrying another woman for the purpose of bearing a child appeared to be an uncommon reason for polygynous marriage. Additionally, among polygynous men, 85.7% and 94.3% respectively reported a good rapport between one wife's children and the other wife. So if you were married to 2 women and they both had kids, there's almost 95% chance that the kids get along with their father's other wife, which I thought was really interesting.
Where did you read? Where's that from?
It is from a study. Let me see if I can.
I'm just curious. Don't worry. Don't dig too hard. I was just curious. So that I would say I'm looking at some of the comments from the other day, and some people are, they're like, oh, it's amazing how Rob's justification is his worldly statistic, not God's word, all caps. Tammy Deering, I hope you tuned into this, because we covered lots of God's word. I would love to hear your rebuttal to some of these.
God commanded it.
God commanded
it.
Go back and give us specific rebuttal now to God's word. Would love to hear people do this. What else? Someone said, looking. Oh yeah, I think the big thing that really upsets women is because it seems so unfair, right? It seems like, hold on, wait, guys get to do this, but women don't. What'd you say to that biblically?
Okay, so I'm going to use a rhetorical question first, and then we'll talk about it biblically. Rhetorical question: do you want another husband?
Okay, but
because I've talked to a fair number of women about this, and they've been like, "That's so unfair," and I'd be like, "Well, do you want another husband?" They're like, "God, no." And so that's just as a rhetorical device. But then here's the thing: thank God the world is not fair. If the world was fair, I really probably should be fried with a lightning bolt right about now.
Right.
Or, the first time I sinned, when I was young. Thank God the world is not fair. We should be on our knees thanking God every single day that the world is not fair. The cross, what's funny? You know what the least fair event in all of man's history is?
The crucifixion.
The cross.
Right.
The least fair thing that ever happened in human history. So is it fair? No, of course it's not fair. But do you really want the world to be fair? I don't. If the world was fair, if I got what I deserve for what I have done, and just to be clear, like, I'm a relatively law-abiding moral person. If you looked at me from the outside, you wouldn't see anything that would, make you want me throw in a prison, or take me to court for anything. Like, I'm law-abiding, relatively. I try to be a relatively moral Christian, but based on God's standard, no, absolutely not. It is not fair, and thank God that the world is not fair.
Yeah,
that's it. And this is the important part. The world is just because God is just.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not now here on earth. Yeah, there's injustice, but if God allows it, it can't be unjust. And I am not concerned with what is fair so much as I am concerned with what does God want and what is. It's not fair that kids get to benefit from their parents' provision for 20 odd years before they move out. That's not fair to the parents.
The other difference is just in the way that men and women handle sex. Like, and I'm not saying it's right, but men can have unemotional sex a lot easier than women can. Women get attached. Biology proves that during sex. Maybe not always. At some point, I think
so do men.
They can get jaded. No, so actually, we attach when we commit, not when we have sex. Women are the gatekeepers of sex. Men are the gatekeepers of commitment. We propose. They say when we have sex the first time. That's.
I'm simply saying
there's no sugarmama.com. There's a sugardaddy.com because men have the security and women have the punani. So like we're surrounded by that and it's proven everywhere. So like the reason that, and I'm not saying it's, but I think,
but here's the thing.
Just in that example alone, it could be seen as different, at least, not to say I get why this upsets them, but I don't think men and women are wired the same. But even beyond that, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what I feel even when Christian women say this. So is it right? I'm like, listen, take it up with the big guy. I didn't write the Bible. I'm just the messenger. I'm just reading it like you are. But I would love I'll add one last thing. I would love all you people in the Waiting Works community, especially because I got a lot of nasty comments in there from all you good, so-called good Christians. Watch this again, take notes, and give me specific rebuttals.
And let me add, check the article on the website because there's something we didn't cover. It's probably on the article. Just Google Berean Patriot, polygyny or polygamy, either one. You should come up. If we didn't touch on it in this podcast, because we did go quickly over some things, I probably touched on it in the article. It's just to add that.
All right, let's keep going. I'm going to see what else we got here. We're going to take a couple more comments, and then we're going to end it. We're coming up. Oh, actually, we're over 2 hours. Jeez, this is my longest podcast ever. I knew it was going to be a long one. This is a heavy topic. All right. Yes, brides. Let's see what we got. Somebody said, talking about polygyny always being a bad outcomes, and somebody said Jacob with 4 wives birthed the nation. How can you say it was disastrous? It's a very good point, Gary.
I mean, it was not harmonious, that's for sure.
We can also say that there's no good examples of monogamous relationships in the Bible either. Like, right? Is there any?
With the possible exception of Mary and Joseph, who I would say don't count for obvious reasons. No, really, almost everybody in the Bible is really messed up.
Let's see this.
Pretty much.
Because if we are open to polygamy, what's to stop us from looking into thruppling? I don't know what that means. That means isn't that like 3 people in a relationship, which is exactly what polygyny is? If God permits polygamy.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm like. Yeah, I'm not sure because polygyny is, and I haven't actually looked up the definition of thruple. I'm just aware of how I've heard it used. That would basically be, thruple would be interchangeable with polyamory, which is polygyny without the marriage. And without the marriage is, yes, the first instance of monogamy did end in disaster.
That's hilarious, Gary. Thank you for that comment. Oh, gosh. That's funny. Okay. A woman does not have the right to forbid it. Okay. Let's see what we got. Just because well, let's see. I think we're kind of beating a dead horse now. Just because it isn't black and white against certain things doesn't mean you can justify it with a lack of black and white supports toward it.
I mean, God commanded it at one point. I would have said that was pretty black and white support for it.
Right. Please explain a single benefit of this to women versus one husband then. I think the benefit, I mean, we talked about it, but again, I think that's where we start to get off course a little bit, because the only point of this is to say, was it sin? Is it sin? Is it morally acceptable to God?
Agreed. Yes, to address a practical benefit, which I didn't actually come up with. This was shared with me by someone who wanted to remain anonymous, more anonymous than I am, which is kind of weird. There actually are practical benefits in terms of running a home, because, it takes X amount of work to make food for, one person, and it's not double the amount of work to make it for 2. So there is an advantage with the division of labor. There is an advantage. Somebody gets sick. Typically, the other one gets sick at a different time. You have sort of a built-in babysitter if somebody needs to go do something. There are practical advantages, and I actually have talked to women who were, and some women listening to this may find this mind-blowing, were interested a little bit just for that.
Mm-hmm.
Sign me up for that. And in nations where it's normal and accepted, and women have the choice, and there's not a whole lot of those because Muslims don't believe that women have souls. So, and a lot of the polygynous countries are Muslim, but in countries where polygyny is accepted and women have the choice, they will often choose to become a second or third wife instead of becoming a first wife. And the factor isn't just sharing a house with other women. It's not.
Yeah.
So there are practical advantages.
I want to read this here. It says, replying to Facebook, why 2 or 3? Why not 5 or 7? Why not 1? And then somebody responded and said, because he can't even attract 1. Well, let's be honest.
But it's a good thing to talk about. Why not 5 or 7? That's a great thing to talk about.
Well, I don't know the number that's ideal, but I will say I could attract plenty ones. I could have probably had more than one if I would have known the information that we're presenting now. I would be married a long time ago, and it would have saved me a lot of pain and heartache, which is what I'm trying to do for other people. Even now I could get married in a plural marriage pretty much anytime I want to just women that I'm talking to. So I know that probably upsets people because it sounds cocky, but I promise you I can attract 1. I can attract, but none of them made sense under monogamy for me. So, and that was because I believe that it's not an ideal relationship structure for everyone. And it's not forbidden by God, which I think we did a pretty good job of proving in this episode.
I do want to address though the why not 5 or 7. The example,
Sure.
The answer is because of the New Testament's prescriptions for husbands for wives. So there's the limitation of you have to be able to have sex with all of them, which sounds like a sort of the humanity kind of problem.
Right.
It is an actual problem. And then more importantly, there's a command in 1 Peter 3, which talks about the requirement of husbands to know their wives. And you can build an intimate relationship with 2 women, maybe 3, but as soon as you end up having a lot of them, it's just not possible. And then let's talk about kids. Children need their father. And remember, love is the goal of Christians, doing what's best for someone else, regardless of what it costs you. And if say you wanted to have 5 wives and you just had 2 or 3 kids with each of them, that's still 10 or 15 kids. You can't be a father to all of those children. You can't. You can't be a good husband to all of those to those wives. So I think the practical, realistic maximum for Christians who want to obey the Bible's commands to husbands is probably 2. Maybe if you were very wealthy, because there's the financial thing too. Kids are expensive, wonderful, but expensive. So
who's to say the women don't want to work? Because that's what the feminists will say. Oh, you're gonna make them stay home and take care of the house and have babies. No, maybe they want to go have a career.
It's possible. The Bible does place the burden on the husband, but then Proverbs 31 says she can work if she wants. So
yeah. I'm an old school. I would want to be the provider, and
I think most men would.
But you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Because if you say no, I'd rather them stay home. Oh, you're misogynistic. Okay, well then let them go to work and contribute to the bills. Oh, you're going to make them go to work and just have a bunch of
it's a little bit.
You're going to be.
I would say this. The Bible does place the responsibility on the man to provide. Not that the woman can't work. Read Proverbs 31. She can. But the responsibility of providing is on the husband. So I'm gonna say this. This is my personal opinion. I don't have scripture for this. This is an appeal to wisdom. But look up the median income wherever you live. If you're a man and you're not making about double the median income in a reasonably secure way, don't even think about getting a second wife.
I don't disagree. But I tell you what this has done for me is I've been very motivated to go out and make money because I'm thinking that this is a real possibility for me. And if all men started thinking like I do, I've gotten in better shape. I've went out and figured out, been thinking about how I'm going to buy the house. Those aren't bad things. And going back to just practically, when I look at the amount of single women that are out there, if someone chooses to do this, who in the hell are you to tell them that this isn't right for them? I mean, what makes you think you know better than what somebody knows what's for themselves? Especially if the Bible doesn't say it, only God can judge. And he's obviously not said this is wrong and commanded us to do it in some cases. But yet some people think, like even this comment here, the real issue here with men justifying polygamy is that the man lacks freedom internally. So it's like, oh, let's say there's something wrong with the man. So there must be something wrong because he lacks freedom. Instead of just saying, show me in the Bible. Like, so you're saying all these great men of God that pursued this lifestyle all had something inherently wrong with them in this one area. They lacked freedom internally versus the fact that this is just something that God is cool with, and maybe it fits into his plan somehow.
Again, I'll go back to God commanded it. And let me point out to you, David was called the man after God's own heart, and he had definitely had more than one wife.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not that he was perfect. He messed up a ton, but he was called a man after God's own heart, and he had more than one wife. So, again, and I'm not saying that you should have multiple wives. As a matter of fact, I think, realistically speaking, no more than 1 or 2% of the men maximum should even have 2. And I really don't. The number of people who could realistically do 3 is so tiny that it almost doesn't matter. But it's not wrong. God commanded it at one point. He never forbade it. And look at the Hebrews 11 Faith Hall of Fame some point, and look at all of the men in the Faith Hall of Fame who had multiple wives. I don't see it being a sin. You can argue that it's unwise. That's fine. You can not want to be involved in it. That's fine too. But I don't think you can say it's a sin. And that's it. Like that is the entirety of my point. I don't want people to call evil good or good evil. And I would say polygyny is good in the sense of it's not morally wrong. So I don't want people calling it morally wrong. I'm not saying you should go get another wife. Again, I think the overwhelming vast majority of men should not have more than one wife.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and start to wrap it up. I just want to, what kind of negative feedback have you received on social media or maybe to your inbox from, people that have found your articles maybe offensive or just, what kind of, what are the things people have said to you?
I don't have social media accounts for Berean Patriot, so I haven't gotten anything there. I have gotten comments in the article, which you're welcome to go read. They're public. And I've gotten a few emails. For the most part, with only 1 or 2 exceptions, they refuse to engage with my primary passage, the primary verse that I would use. There's many, but the primary one is that one in Exodus about God commanding polygyny. They would talk about everything else. They would not engage with that verse.
Well, I wouldn't challenge anybody out there because I know that I got even a pastor reach out to me recently, and he was a very educated guy, and I would challenge him to go, give us a specific rebuttal to some of the things that were said here. Maybe we'll do a follow-up to this. I won't do it in the Waiting Works community, so you're going to have to follow me on YouTube or anywhere else. But I do want to really quickly plug the groups. If you're out there and you're waiting, you're trying to save sex for marriage, or you're saving sex for marriage, you can join the Waiting Works community. It's about close to 4,000 people in there, and they encourage each other and try to hold each other accountable. And it's a good group. I know this has kind of caused everybody, it stirred everybody up in there, but this topic will be going away from that group. But I also have a men's group called the Unplugged Christian Alphas for guys that want to level up and find a high value Christian woman or women after reading this. Potentially, maybe you're like, hey, I think this sounds like it might be a good fit.
Again, though, it is illegal.
Well, that may be where we disagree, because I don't believe that I have to get married in a government sanctioned wedding. I'm not going to let the government stop me from doing what I believe God is leading me to do.
Well, then I would say this: at least move to Utah, where it has been decriminalized effectively to the point where it's not criminal anymore.
And that's where I really feel like we have a chance of going with this movement.
I should point out it's illegal federally because of the Supreme Court. I think it's Supreme Court. So
I'll get married in the eyes of God, and that to me is much more serious than the eyes of the government. Like, that wouldn't have meant much to me before, but I won't get divorced in the eyes of God. I'll ride it out. So, but I would say that I really believe that this movement has a chance of doing what the homosexual movement did in the 60s and 70s, where the people that were, homosexual, they were quiet about it and didn't want to tell people because maybe they were afraid of getting beat up or whatever. And that's where I see the people that are polygynists. They're kind of quiet. They don't want to be excommunicated from their church or whatever communities that they're part of. And I'm like, no, if I do this, I'm talking about it. I'm gonna be loud and proud with it. And hopefully we can make it, take the stigma away from it so that
that point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, so the people that want to pursue it aren't afraid to do it, because I do think that it would do massive good in the world. And like you've proven in this episode, I believe that God is fine with it.
I think so. An interesting fact. So the Oberfeld decision, which legalized the counterfeit that the left likes to call gay marriage, because it's not marriage.
Yeah.
The decision that legalized that, which obviously it's a real problem. Obviously that's immoral and unethical, and like I have a real problem with that. But
absolutely,
my point is, in that decision, the I think it was the Chief Justice who wrote the decision said, so there's a problem with this decision, and that is the arbitrary inclusion of the word "to." There's no real reason why the same arguments that were used to decide this case couldn't apply to polygamy. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's actually in the Oberfeld decision. And again, it was a terrible decision. It was morally reprehensible. I do that. It was wrong. I'm not in favor of that at all. It was a dark day. It was a bad thing. Like, I'm not in favor of that at all.
I hate to even compare this to that, but I'm just, it's not the best analogy, but you get the point.
Sure. So maybe we will see that. It certainly does seem like it's coming up more, again, mostly because of, the polyamory thing, and people like Andrew Tate who are like, hey, yeah, I just sleep with all these women all this time, no commitment, no marriage, no nothing, which is awful and wrong. And I feel bad for the fellow, and I probably should pray for him because what he's advocating is utterly immoral.
Yeah.
But
definitely.
Silver lining to some very evil things. It does seem like that may possibly move the culture slightly in the direction of, okay, so maybe polygyny isn't so awful.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Let's pray for Andrew Tate's salvation, everyone, because he's got such
absolutely.
It'd be great if he came over to Christianity and start giving men good advice instead of bad advice. But let's do this before we wrap it up. Two things. I want to plug the groups again, the Waiting Works community. You can go to realloveawaits.com. It'll take you directly to the Facebook group. It's free to join. Just answer a couple questions. Men, you can go to unpluggedchristian.com. Takes you directly to the Facebook group. Same thing. Answer a couple questions. Before we get off, I just summarize the key points that we discussed in the interview. If you could just kind of recap the key points. I know you do this in all your articles, so it'd be cool if you could do that, and then we'll share your final thoughts.
So most of the passages against polygyny, and again, we covered them. I haven't the article. Actually, if you could put up, BereanPatriot.com, so you know where to go. Just and you won't be able to find it on the homepage, by the way. That's I have some personal reasons for that, but if you just Google Berean Patriot polygyny, you should find it. I go through all the articles. The only one that holds any real weight is the 1 Timothy husband of one wife passage, which you could argue could forbid polygynous men from being church elders, but it doesn't apply to everyone. So there's that. The arguments, they don't really hold water when you look at the original languages and the context. And again, I have that on the website. And then the most important argument for is that God commanded it at one point. And you just put it in the thing. Yeah. The most important point for polygyny is that God commanded it more than once. He commanded it 2 places generally in the law. Under these conditions, you must take a second wife. And then he commanded one of his prophets to take 2 wives. He in parable pictures himself as a polygynist. So did Jesus. Again, just in a parable, Jesus never married, obviously. So I don't think that we can call it a sin. Again, it may be unwise. It may be a bad idea. It may be all of those things. You may not want to do it, and that's fine. I'm not going to say that you should. I'm simply saying that you should not call that which is good in the sense of morally permissible. You should not call what is good evil. And I don't think that polygyny is evil. I think God commanded it. He never forbidden it. commanded in the law and then never forbid it later. So I don't think we can call it sin. If you don't want to get involved, totally fine. Completely understand.
Yep, I agree. So look, everybody's still commenting. You're interpreting scripture wrong. Be specific. I would say to you, false teachers, be specific.
Yes, be specific. If you want to rebut this, please be specific. Don't just say, hey, you twisted the scriptures. Point out, okay, in this verse, you said this, but that's not true. The actual truth is this. So please be specific if you want to rebut. I've changed my mind before because of people who have emailed me or left comments. I've changed my mind before. Berean Patriot. I try to live up to the name. So if you have a specific objection, please, by all means, but be specific. Don't just say this is wrong and it's immoral. Point to chapter and verse why it's wrong and immoral.
Agreed. And hey, look, and people are triggered. I can tell some of the people in the comments. Yeah, guys, there's a lot of people you can follow in the world. You don't have to follow me. I mean, I like to please everybody, but she just couldn't even do that. So I'm not going to try. So,
I have somebody say, what's your email? If you go to bereanpatriot.com, there's a contact page. My email is there.
All right. Lastly, let me just see what I got here. I basically just wanted any final thoughts or advice for individuals who are considering polygynous relationships?
So if you're in a country where it's not illegal, be really sure marriage is a very permanent thing. It's going to be a bad idea in pretty much all maybe not all, but in the vast majority of circumstances, it would be a bad idea. You have to be able to support the additional wives. If you live in a country where it's illegal, boy, you're going to have to do some. Romans 13 is really hard to get around. And I understand the argument, but
this is what's crazy. It's legal to go out and screw as many girls as you want and impregnate them all. Have as many babies outside you want as you want outside of wedlock. Fuck somebody in the ass of the same sex. Kill the baby if you do impregnate a girl before it's born. All those things are legal. But you can't marry a second person if you're in love with them. And you should obey that one. So like what I would say, give me this at least. Berean Patriot. Is it better? Because there's guys out there that are watching this that are fornicating.
Sure.
Is it better than fornicating? Like, I mean, if they weren't going to get married in a monogamous marriage, but they would get married in a polygynous marriage, but they may have to do it the way that I've said in the eyes of the church and not, in the eyes of the government, would that be better than fornicating? Because in my mind, I think it would be.
So this is what I would say. If you're thinking about multiple wives, you should have one first and be halfway decent at it first before you think about taking a second one. But I don't actually think that argument works very well because, again, the argument is why do you get to ignore the Romans' command on obeying the government in the issue of polygamy? And that is a very, very difficult hurdle to overcome. I've heard arguments that are somewhat persuasive, but I don't think I'm persuaded of that because, again, it's pretty clear, and it's not like the government is forbidding all marriage, just forbidding two wives. Like they're forbidding that. So you can do that morally. The overwhelming vast majority of men and women would be involved in a monogamous marriage anyway. And so to say that, we get to disobey that command because we want to, that's a really, I think you and I might have to agree to disagree on this, but that's an enormous leap to say we can disobey this command.
Well, okay. Well, let's talk about concubines, right? Because Jews practice that. Some of them still do. And that, as far as I know, is biblical, is it not?
So like, I'm glad you brought that up. I am so glad you brought that up. Concubines are wives. So
but not under the eyes of the government or what?
So, well, okay. Biblically speaking, concubines are wives. Okay. And I don't know that I actually talk about this in any articles. I know I talked about it in the comments, but so Abraham married a woman after Sarah died. Her name is Keturah. And I believe it's in Genesis that she's called a wife, and in Chronicles she's called a concubine. I would say that from the research that I've done, a concubine is a wife who is also a slave. There's also that incident in Judges, which is pretty frankly horrific. A man has a concubine, and the concubine goes back home, and the man follows her home, and it says he goes to his father-in-law's house. So it's very clear that a concubine is married. I believe the difference is a normal wife is a free woman and a concubine is a slave. I believe that is the difference. That is my current understanding. It could be wrong.
Here's a good point. Some states are requiring pastors to marry gays.
Okay,
so
but
they have to obey the law?
No, because where the law requires us to sin, we don't have to obey. And let's make a distinction.
If God commanded us to do it, if I have a brother and if he dies, I can't go out and marry his wife. Then I'd have to be disobeying the law.
Old Testament law, you no longer have to follow the Old Testament law. Read Galatians.
Okay, good enough.
So, and again, there is a difference between if the government commands you not to do, or if the government commands you to do something that's wrong, go to Acts 4 and 5. Judge, is it better that we should obey man than God?
Yeah.
On the other side of the thing, if the government commands you to do something that is, or commands you not to do something that is morally fine to do, disobeying them gets a little bit sticky. Because if the Bible hasn't commanded you to do it, then you don't really have a good leg to stand on to ignore the government.
I don't think you're not breaking the law unless you marry them in the government-sanctioned marriage. Which Adam and Eve didn't have a government-sanctioned marriage. I bet you David didn't have a government-sanctioned marriage. I bet you
and I understand. And at that point, that's a much longer conversation about how his marriage.
I bet you even in Jesus' day, the marriages probably weren't even government-sanctioned. They were in Rome. They were for the reasons of inheritance and stuff. But again, remember, for most of man's history, marriage was an arrangement. No. Well, that's what
read Genesis. Somebody tried that with one of Jacob's daughters, and his brothers slaughtered a whole city for it because it was considered to be so wrong. It was an arrangement between two families. So there is an argument to be made that you don't have to get the government involved. But again, that's different. Saying that you can get married on a desert island without the formal recognition of the government is different than saying, our government says you may not have more than one wife. And then you saying, I'm going to go have more than one wife. So again, I hear the arguments. I understand them. I am always going to err on the side of, unless you have a really insanely good passage you can point to that I'm unaware of, and it may be out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm going to lean on Romans 13 because if you want to work to make it legal, go for it.
I have seen a rebuttal to this, and it was something along the lines of what I said, where obeying God's laws versus man's. And I don't know. It might have been a terrible defense of it. I'll try to find it, but I would actually ask if anybody out there in favor of polygyny or what we're saying here, they have some information to share. Please send it to me because I'd like to know, because people are going to ask that for sure. It was like, well, the laws of the land, obeying the laws of the land, are we not held to those? So
many people have said that in the comments, and again, I certainly can't make the argument. I don't have chapter and verse to say it's okay to ignore that.
Yeah, this wasn't really the point of the podcast.
Sure.
The point of the podcast was, is it sin or not? Let's investigate what the Bible says about it, and I think we did a pretty good job of covering it. So, man, I appreciate it, dude. This was, it was another fantastic episode, but I'm hoping that it really helps some people out there, and just challenges people. I know some people are going to want to stick their fingers in their ears on this one because it's not something that they're going to like. But I can't help but think about the religious people throughout the Bible. They always, when God was trying to bring people back to a certain truth where they got off track maybe, and use someone to do that, the religious people always oppose those people. John the Baptist, Jesus, many of the prophets. And I feel like times haven't changed. They accused Jesus of having a demon too.
Well, but then again, and I understand where you're going, and I happen to think you're right that you're going to catch flack for pointing out when the church is teaching something that's wrong, or But then there's the other side of it too, where you always got to make sure that you remain open to the possibility you could be wrong. So again, BereanPatriot.com, go to the contact page. If you can have specific proof, you can point out something I said that's wrong, please do reach out to Rob. I'm sure he would be happy to listen. But again, be specific. If you think this is wrong, be real specific.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for all the comments. Appreciate y'all tuning in, especially everybody in the Waiting Works community. I know you had to have an extremely open mind to watch this. So thank you for that. Share it with somebody that maybe needs to hear it. And let's figure out if we're going to do another one. I'd love to do one on homosexuality soon, if we, in the next couple of weeks, if you're free, bring you back for that.
Maybe.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what you said last time. So I'll be praying that God gives you the peace to come back. So, all right, guys, do me a favor, drop a couple thumbs up, a couple hearts for Pat if you learned something, even if you maybe didn't agree with what he had to say. Just give us 3 hours of his time. So.
Can I add one last thing?
Yeah, please.
If you think I'm wrong, actually, whether you think I'm right or you think I'm wrong, please pray for me. Because if you think I'm wrong, pray that God will show me the error of my ways. I will pull the article, or more likely archive the article and replace it with another article rebutting my original article. So if you think I'm wrong, pray that God will show me that I'm wrong. That's
so good that you said that. That's exactly what I told people before. I was like, pray for me that if I'm being deceived, that God lets me know, because I have good discernment. I think, I feel like this is God telling me. So if I'm wrong, please. But, I haven't heard that yet. So anyway, appreciate it. Thanks again, Pat. We'll see you guys on the next one.